All right, hello everyone. You might notice that I'm in a different place to usual. That's because, and this is a different time to usual as well, if you're watching this live and pay attention to such things. That's because I am on the road. I'm actually in the US at the moment, in Chicago, attending the Society for Neuroscience conference. I'm presenting a poster there, and I have a little time this evening. And because I've been on the road checking YouTube and, trying to get by on the plane and things like that, I've been noticing perhaps a bit more of capturing Christianity and other Christian apologetics nonsense on YouTube than I usually do. Although I sort of often see such things anyway. But the point is, I thought, well, look, I've got some time this evening, so why not do a bit of a response and talk about a few things. There's a couple of videos in particular that I would like to discuss. So let's do that. Um, if you're interested in what I'm presenting, by the way, I'm presenting some of the final research for my PhD, which I should be completing in a few months, at the end of this year. So that's exciting. I'll give you a little preview of my poster, which I'm kind of don't really want to explain, but I thought I'll show you briefly anyway, just for fun, eh? Um, if I can find how to show it. Why does it not give me this window? Okay, here it is. Yeah, so here's my poster. My research involves studying how language is processed in the brain. So I've done some fMRI data collection and analysis using large language models, and look, it's all sciencey with like graphs and even brain activity mapping and things like that. So it's pretty fun. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing. Now let's see what Cameron's been doing over on Capturing Christianity. Well, I say that, but I kind of already know. Uh, so let me just share that because there's a couple of videos that I wanted to go over. Okay, so no, that's the wrong one. So first, let's just do our usual recap to have a look at the general sort of topics that he's been covering in the last couple of months or so. I can't remember exactly when our last. Well, I guess the last time I did a response to a bunch of the demon possession stuff that he'd been focused on. So you see, this period of 5 to 4 months ago, we had a lot of. This is the recorded video, like pre-recorded videos section. So we had a lot of demon possession stuff. So where is it? Exorcisms, 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 possession, more exorcism, and then more exorcism and more exorcism and more demons. I think there's been maybe a couple more of those since then, or maybe not actually, because we seem to have gone in a bit of a different direction. I don't know if demonic possessions have played themselves out for the moment, or they'll probably make a comeback. Yeah, so Nidhi's already identified one topic, which I probably won't cover this. Well, we'll see if we get to it. It's one topic that's obviously of interest to me. It's a bit, I think, needs a bit more time to go through. But yes, that's been one recent development. So since we got off the demonic possession exorcisms train, we seem to have gotten on more of a political, socio-political train. So we've had quite a few videos regarding controversies at the Olympics. So apparently there was a part of the opening ceremony which featured a parody of the Last Supper, although it's not even clear that that's what it was parodying, because apparently it was some other painting that was parodying. Anyway, so that was offensive. Apparently, I don't know why that's offensive, that someone does a parody of something relating to Christianity. Uh, that just feels like that's part of Western culture and can be reused and reappropriated in all sorts of ways. I don't know that it's mocking any particular belief or practice, but whatever. That was so offensive that it required 2 videos. No, I lie, 3 videos, because then there was the Vatican response to that. So I'm not going to look at those. I think that's just pure grifting. You can see here that the first video got 500,000 views, which is much more than he. Let me zoom in a bit here. Oops. Now I've done that thing where they all move. Let's just Okay. Yeah, that's much more than he usually gets. And so naturally, he needs to follow that up with two more on the same topic. Then we had the whole uh, gender athlete controversy thing that was big for a while. So we had, of course, two videos on that because that's very important to Christianity, I think. And then we've had a bunch of stuff on Trump. One of which I did want to cover, so we'll come back to that. More prophecy stuff. That is something that I will be discussing here. Um, and we've also had a bunch of stuff on the Shroud of Turin recently, like 4 videos here. I'm actually not sure if that's a Shroud one. And I think some more in lives as well. So the Shroud of Turin is obviously a big topic. That's something that I want to cover with Nathan in a Bad Apologetics episode. It's been on my radar for quite a few years now. Um, so yeah, I don't know exactly when we'll get to that, but stay tuned, essentially. So I won't go through that now. So that's just another thing that Cameron's been really pressing on quite hard lately. Oh yeah, here's another Shroud one. And then even more recently than that, we seem to have been covering a fair bit of Islam. I don't really know why. Wait, there was another video on this? Jeez. Anyway, so we've had quite a few videos about the Quran, Islam. I guess Craig had a debate with a Muslim scholar about the Trinity, so maybe that triggered that. Yeah, so we have that debate here and then a review of the debate. I don't really care that much about, well, I do, because I am actually interested in the doctrine of the Trinity, but I don't want to cover that right now. What I did want to cover is some of the prophecy stuff. So this is one of the things that triggered me, particularly, not triggered in the internet sense, that just led me to want to respond to this. So this one here, this video about, it's titled about being about Muhammad, but it's actually involves a comparison with Joseph Smith as well. I haven't watched the video, I've just sort of looked through it quickly, but because of my Mormon background, that's something I'm particularly interested in. So I wanted to give this video here a review. So we'll go through that. And I also wanted to contrast that because this is a video relating to prophecies. I don't know exactly what the nature of that is, but Cameron is talking about prophecies there. And I wanted to contrast that with this video here, which, and maybe some of the previous ones, because Cameron has produced a number of videos recently about prophecies relating to Trump as well, and like surviving yeah, this guy, the Trump prophet, who apparently predicted his assassination, and then there's the second assassination attempt, which Trump, which just occurred recently, and so that's being advocated as well, something. I haven't watched this video, but I want to see what they actually say here. So I guess prophecies is a broad theme today. We'll see where we go with this. But yeah, just wanted to start off with looking at the direction the channel's been taking. So a lot of socio-political stuff relating to first the Olympics and then Islam and also Trump. Maybe demons will make a comeback. Who knows? If they do, I'll be here for them. But enough of that. Let's talk about Muhammad and Joseph Smith. So let's jump over to this video here. Because I'm not on my normal setup, if those in chat can let me know if sound doesn't work or something, and we can hopefully fix that. But all right, let's have a look at this video.
And I mean completely disqualifies himself as a true prophet based on his once you see this,
wait, maybe
today we're going to discuss how Muhammad completely, and I mean completely, disqualifies himself as a true prophet based on his own claims in the Quran. Forget every other argument you think you have for Islam. This one point alone is enough to show that he's a complete fraud. And once you see this, there's literally like no going back. If you've ever wondered whether Muhammad was a true prophet sent by God.
Thanks, JPB. Yeah, this is not a bad apologetics, but hopefully it will scratch that itch a little bit, and we'll see. We'll see if we want to cover some more of this later.
You need to stay for this entire video because we're going to put him to the test. All right, so let's get right into it. So if there is a God and he does send us messengers to help guide us, then he's going to give us ways to tell like which ones are the real ones, which ones are the fake ones. But Muhammad makes a claim.
Okay, that's actually an important point there. So this relates to the issue of special revelation. So the idea is that God can communicate to humanity in broadly 2 ways. He can communicate through creation, which involves, well, it's sort of a little vague exactly how that communicates, but we can tell through looking at the cosmos or the existence of life, or consult our moral intuitions or something. And by examining these sort of broad features of reality, we can determine that God exists, right? So a lot of natural theology attempts to construct arguments for God's existence and determine his attributes and so on through this sort of natural um, revelation. Then there's special revelation, which involves um, God communicating in some more direct way to, well, theoretically could be anyone, but often to specific people who are his prophets, right? This is interesting philosophically because it raises a number of questions about um, epistemological questions like testimony, for example. So how can you, if someone claims to be a prophet of God, how can you know whether they're a prophet of God? How can you trust them, even if they theoretically could be justified in believing the message they received from God? How can the rest of us trust them or have a sufficient confidence that they did receive a message from God? There's also a further question as to, suppose you are a prophet and you believe that you have a message from God, how would you know that that was truly from God? How could you distinguish it from your imagination or a hallucination or aliens who are implanting thoughts in your mind or some other perhaps implausible but also God delivering revelation to you specifically is implausible? So how can you distinguish these different hypotheses? So there's some interesting questions here, and I want to cover more about this topic, perhaps going into the future, about sort of the epistemology behind that, because I think, yeah, it's questionable whether that's something that a God would do or that would he have reason to do, to sort of communicate to us in this sort of highly uncertain way. But anyway, supposing that God did want to communicate to mankind through a single messenger like this, um, we would, as Cameron says, need some way of determining whether that messenger was actually a prophet of God. Um, because every religious tradition acknowledges that there are many false prophets. So we have to have a way of making this distinction. Okay, fair enough. So how do we make that distinction, and what does Cameron have to say? And particularly my interest in this video is going to be on assessing whether, whatever the criteria that Cameron uses, does he fairly apply that to prophecies or other miracles or other similar claims that he would take as veridical or truly coming from God, from Christianity? Is he applying that fairly? That's my interest here, so we'll see.
In the Quran that no true prophet ever would. And once you see how this plays out, it's actually just over. Like it's done. Like he's out. He's done. In this video, I'm going to walk you through a very simple test, a test that shows Muhammad.
So that's, I mean, this I think is deliberately sensational, right? Because I mean, you can always make up excuses, right? You can always come up with ad hoc counter arguments to save the phenomena, regardless of how apparently convincing the evidence against it is. I mean, and Christians do this all the time when they want to kind of reconcile very obvious discrepancies in the Bible, that they come up with all this sort of fan fiction to justify why it is that the apparent contradiction is not really a contradiction. Inspiring Philosophy has a whole series of these on his channel, by the way, which I should probably go through maybe with Nathan at some point and see how plausible those are. But the point is that this is one of the reasons why I don't believe in kind of knockdown arguments, because you can always come up with a counter that justifies well, anything really. The question is going to be how plausible is that? How ad hoc or contrived is it, or does it in fact fit with our background knowledge? So and is fairly parsimonious. So it's not an issue of something being sort of a knockdown case. Sorry, a knockdown argument against any particular thing. It's an issue of assessing different explanatory hypotheses and how plausible they are. But I suspect that Cameron would agree with that if pressed, and is deliberately being sensational. So whatever. I mean, given this title, that's sort of obvious.
Muhammad's
So
claim
I'm
to
just,
being a prophet
I guess the point
doesn't
is, I'm just going to interpret what he says in that light and assume that what he's saying is that there's no sort of plausible explanation for whatever he's about to say here.
actually hold up. What's actually really cool about this test is that it doesn't rely on the Bible or on the New Testament or anything else. It's a sort of internal check to see whether or not a prophet is real, and Muhammad fails it miserably. All right, so let's break this down. So if God does send a prophet to guide us, there's a lot of different ways that he could use to make them sort of stand out. Miracles, for example, would definitely help, or maybe these prophets could predict the future, giving us proof that they're connected to something beyond.
Okay, so I think that claim there, that miracles would help to determine that a prophet was truly of God, I think that's just false according to the Bible, right? Because there's that passage from I don't remember what book it's from, but it's when Moses is asking Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, and Moses demonstrates a number of miracles to illustrate the power that God's given him, and Pharaoh's priests are able to replicate a number of those. I don't remember exactly which ones, and then there's some I think that they can't. I know there are other instances in the Bible as well where non-prophets perform miracles as well. That's one that I remember specifically. Yeah, it's probably in Exodus. Um, so the point is, the Bible clearly shows that non-prophets, that is, people who are not genuine messengers of God, can perform at least some types of miracles, perhaps not all. So I don't know that this claim that Cameron's making here is even biblical. So I'm pretty skeptical about that. And even if you put the biblical case aside, it's sort of not obvious why, let's say, you could heal someone miraculously, or walk on water, or appear in the sky, or foretell future events. How does that show that you're receiving messages from God? Uh, it's not really clear. That you're receiving powers from God would be one potential explanation for these phenomena. But again, you're going to have to contrast that against other potential explanations, like that you have magical powers, that you're receiving those powers from um, some kind of powerful being, but who's not the God of the universe. Uh, like a demigod or something, or that you're being assisted by powerful aliens, or that you have advanced technology that no one understands, that you're a time traveler, right? Now, these explanations may be implausible. Again, that you are a true prophet from the God of the universe is also an implausible claim. Most people who claim to be prophets aren't. Um, so, again, you're going to have to adjudicate the plausibility of those different explanations. And I think the point is that even conditional on performing like real miracles, it's still very much unclear how high the probability is that you're going to be a true messenger of God. I mean, I don't really know how you assess that. What you would need to do, and this is actually my critique of the resurrection and many other arguments, you can't actually assess meaningfully the probability that any particular prophet is from God unless you know the type of person, the type of prophet God would be likely to send. Um, and this is why Christians and Muslims never agree on this, because Muslims just fundamentally think that it's the way they think about God, it's completely implausible that God would ever incarnate, and the idea of the Trinity is completely ridiculous to them, and so they just totally discount the idea that, well, they say Jesus was a prophet, right, but that his message was misunderstood and corrupted, and they completely discount the specific claims that Christians make about um, Christian theology that Jesus allegedly taught, and Paul and so forth. Like, they completely discount all that stuff. Um, and vice versa, Christians also find aspects of the Islamic God of Allah to be implausible, like the oneness, for example, and the idea of the Quran sort of coming directly from God rather than sort of revealed to, well, it is revealed to Muhammad, but it's written by God and then just spoken by Muhammad, right? Which is a bit different to how most Christians think about the Bible being written. Um, so anyway, the point is that because they have different beliefs about the nature of God, they find each other's claims about revelation implausible. And this is the case for many other religious traditions as well. So it's not just a case of from God or not. You can't really assess that without having some baseline beliefs, some background beliefs about what type of messenger would God send. Um, and this is why I think that the whole project of special revelation is doomed to failure, because you can't tell whether something is special revelation until you know how to assess whether God would reveal that or something else as special revelation. And to know that, you need to know something about the nature of God. Maybe not everything, but you need to know enough. And where does that knowledge come from? It's sort of circular, right? In order to know if a prophet is truly from God, you need to know what type of prophet God would send. But the only way you can find that out is through special revelation. So you need to have a prophet. Um, and this is effectively, this is in fact how religious faiths justify themselves. It's circular, right? That you make predictions about the type of prophets that God would want to send based on the very words of the prophets that you already accept for antecedent reasons, right? So I think the whole project is fundamentally unsound, and there's not really any basis for adjudicating who God would likely send as a prophet. This idea about miracles being one method of determination is, as I said, not biblical, A, and B, problematic, because the ability to do things that are inexplicable really doesn't have any obvious connection to being from God, unless you have a very particular theory about the types of people God would be likely to send. Anyway, thanks, Jim. Good to see you here. Bad guys. Hey, Sully says bad guys can do witchcraft and sorcery. Miracles are a good guy power. Yeah, exactly. It's you just call it different things, and it's it's sort of not obvious what the real difference is. So we're just having a quick look at chat. All right, let's keep going.
On the natural world, these wouldn't necessarily prove that they're a prophet, but it would definitely help. But there's actually another way that I think is a little bit more reliable. So if God sends a series of prophets, he could have the earlier ones tell us what to expect from the later ones. And that way, when the next prophet shows up, we already have some clues about what to expect. Maybe it's like a name, maybe it's a specific place that they're from, or even certain characteristics that we should be on the lookout for. And of course, not every prophet needs to be foretold. The first prophet, for example, wouldn't have anyone to predict them. But if you are foretold by an earlier prophet, it's definitely something that you'd want to make clear, because I think that would be really, really good evidence. And here's where the problem.
Well, obviously, if you establish that one person was a prophet with high confidence, and then they told you that, well, there's this other guy coming who will also be a prophet, that would count as pretty strong evidence if that second person did come. Of course, the problem then is going to be identification, right? So suppose that we have, maybe I'll make up some names to make it easier. So suppose we have a prophet called Jimbo, and for whatever reason, we're just really confident that Jimbo is a genuine prophet, right? Let's forget about why. Let's just say that we are. And Jimbo foretells that in 100 years' time, there will be a new prophet who is, another genuine, honest to God prophet. And then they make certain predictions about them. Maybe they name them, or maybe they describe the circumstances that they preach in, or something like that. And let's call the second prophet, I don't know, Bob, right? So Jimbo says the next prophet will be Bob, and he says a few things about him. Now, the obvious problem here is that if Jimbo's prophecies are known about at the time, or before Bob is supposed to come, then you can't really distinguish someone who is just claiming to be Bob from the genuine Bob, right? Now, maybe Jimbo could make some prophecies that are very hard for someone to engineer or lie about. So that is possible, though it seems that many of the later prophecies in the Bible aren't like this. And also, you have to be very careful about this, because it is many things are easy to either engineer if you want to, like if you truly believe that you're a prophet and feel like that these things should be true, then you sort of engineer them to be true, or for people to just make up after the fact. So you have to avoid anything like that. And so the point is, even if someone is, oh yeah, and that was the case whether it's known beforehand. Now, if Jimbo's prophecies about Bob are not known before Bob comes along, then there's always the problem of verifying that they were in fact made before Bob, because if they only come to light after Bob comes along, then they could, of course, been written after Bob and just ex post fit to describe Bob. So this is the other issue, like with the book of Daniel, for example. It gives a number of prophecies, some of which seem to be very accurate, and then after a point they cease to be accurate, and that's how scholars sort of date when they think the book was written, right? So it's sort of a problem either way. If the prophecies are known beforehand, then you can engineer the fulfillment of those prophecies, unless they're very carefully sort of designed. If the prophecies are not known beforehand, then you need to verify that they were made beforehand and not in fact made afterwards. So again, theoretically, you can do that, right? That you could imagine a book being written and then being sealed and kept under guard or something for a long enough period of time to verify that it hadn't been tampered with. In practice, this basically never happens and would be very difficult to do over long periods of time. How would you verify that records in the ancient world were not tampered with for 100 years, for example? There's very hard to see how that could happen and how we would have sufficient evidence of this. I mean, even in modern times, that would be hard. With modern technology, we could do that. But in the pre-industrial world, I don't really know how this could plausibly be done. So this idea that, well, an established prophet can predict a future prophet, in theory, that sounds okay. But if you actually think about the details of it, it's very hard to actually ensure that the prediction was made beforehand, and also no one was able to engineer subsequent prophets to fit that prediction, and also that the prediction wasn't modified after the fact and was sufficiently specific enough so that we also don't just sort of reinterpret it later on to fit. And this, I think, explains basically all the prophecies in the Bible. They're either written after the fact, or people knew about the prophecy and so conformed themselves to fit the prophecy, or the prophecies were reinterpreted after the fact. And it's very hard to avoid all of those three possibilities. not impossible, but in practice, basically never happens, I think. So let's see what Cameron has to say. I guess an example that supposedly rules out Muhammad.
Problem with Muhammad starts to come in. Just like a con artist could lie and forge a signature, a fake prophet could also lie and say what they were foretold by an earlier prophet when they actually weren't. And so, how do we figure out who's actually telling the truth? Well, I've got a very simple 4-question test that will expose anyone who tries to lie about being a prophet. And really, like, shouldn't prophets worth listening to be able to pass a basic test? But before we test out Muhammad, let's actually put this test in action with another guy that I think most of us will be familiar with, and most of us actually consider to be a false prophet, namely Joseph Smith. So let's take a trip back to the early 1800s to a small town in upstate New York. The year is 1830, and a young man named Joseph Smith is claiming something very big, something that would eventually lead to the founding of the Mormon Church. Smith wasn't just saying that he had a message from God. He claimed that his arrival was foretold thousands of years ago by none other than Joseph, the son of Jacob, in the Old Testament. Now, imagine that you're hearing this claim back in the 1830s. You'd be fairly, to put it lightly, you'd be probably a little bit intrigued, right? Like, there's a modern day prophet predicted by an ancient biblical figure. Naturally, you'd want to open your Bible and see if this was actually true. So Smith pointed to Genesis 50:33 as the prophecy supposedly foretelling his coming. So you grab a Bible, flip to Genesis 50, and you find nothing. As we can see here, the last verse in Genesis 50 is actually verse 26. There's no verse 33 in this chapter at all. No prophecy about Joseph Smith. And here's where things start to really unravel for.
Hang on. So Cameron here is saying that Joseph Smith said that his coming was foretold in the Bible and quoted this verse, but he doesn't. Did I miss that? Where does Cameron give the evidence that Joseph Smith quoted this particular verse? Because this is not something I'm familiar with. I mean, there's a lot of things that Mormons say that I'm not familiar with, but
foretelling his coming. So you grab a Bible, flip to Genesis 50, and you find
where did he talk
prophecy
about
supposedly
Genesis
foretelling
50?
his coming. So you grab a Bible, flip to Genesis 50, and you find nothing. As we can see here, the last verse in Genesis 50 is actually verse 26. There's no verse
Maybe he'll
33
clarify,
in
because I'm
this
not sure
chapter
what
at
he's
all.
talking
No
about at
prophecy
this
about
point.
Joseph Smith. And here's where things start to really unravel for our friend Joseph. You'd expect something as important as a prophecy about a new modern day prophet to be preserved somewhere, right? Like, it's got to be somewhere, but it's not. It's nowhere to be found. This prophecy exists only in Joseph Smith's personal translation, the Joseph Smith translation, or JST, which he himself produced in the 1830s. There is no ancient manuscript or historical support for this prophecy. But to make this problem abundantly clear, let's run Joseph Smith through.
So is that where he's getting this from? The fact that this is in the Joseph Smith translation? So, so the Joseph Smith translation, I do not think was. Maybe he's being, because he mentioned 1830, right? But I'm pretty sure that wasn't produced at that time. I think that was later. I'm just checking the dates here, and that's not something, to my knowledge, that was really used in evangelizing. Yeah, most of this was done between 1830 and 1833. But I didn't know that this was ever really published. So if you buy copies of the Bible produced by the Latter-day Saint Church, they will have footnotes in them, some of which contain additions or modifications to the text that were part or are part of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. So that's where most Mormons get their knowledge of the JST from, the Joseph Smith translation. But the Latter-day Saint Church doesn't even officially use the Joseph Smith translation. They still officially use the King James version, but again with footnotes that are, some of which do refer to the Joseph Smith translation. And it's absolutely true that Joseph Smith added to parts of the Bible and modified things which in various ways sort of bolstered certain Mormon doctrinal claims, and for which there is no manuscript evidence. I'm not disputing that point. But I don't really understand what Cameron is saying here about the idea that this particular passage was used for evangelistic purposes and advanced as evidence of Joseph Smith's prophethood. It doesn't even really make sense, right? Because the context in which, well, first of all, the JST wasn't completed in 1830. It was completed later. I don't think it was really published at that time. And because it was never finished, it was mostly completed, but never properly finished before Joseph Smith was killed. And but the other thing is that the religious context in which Mormonism arose, everyone used the King James version, right? Everyone in the area of upstate New York and surrounding areas. So it's obviously going to do no good to refer to passages that didn't exist in that King James version as evidence of Joseph Smith. So I just don't think that what Cameron is saying is a thing. I mean, if someone knows more about what he's talking about here, that is, if you can provide evidence that early Latter-day Saints did use this prophecy as evidence of Joseph Smith's prophethood, I'd be very interested in that, because it's not something I'm familiar with or have ever heard of, actually. As to the point about Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, if you have reason for thinking that Joseph Smith was a true prophet, then there's not really going to be a problem with him producing an alternate translation of the Bible, which, according to him, includes some modifications of passages to better reflect the original texts, because we don't have the original texts of any of the Bible. Even the very earliest, I think we have like a few fragments of John from the 1st century, right? Or maybe it's late. No, I think it's early 2nd century. So they probably date to within a few decades of the original manuscript. I think that's about as close as it gets. But even a few decades is more than enough time for errors to be introduced. And even then, it's only a few fragments. We certainly don't have complete books that cover anything like that until centuries afterwards. Yeah, it's 2nd century. I think I'm remembering because someone claimed that it was 1st century, but it turned out to be 2nd century. Anyway, the point is, there is nothing really that implausible about someone claiming that there are textual errors in the Bible that were introduced very early on, for which there is no surviving textual evidence, like variant manuscripts or something like that. In fact, it's almost certain that that is true. Now, there's no reason for thinking that what was included in the original writings is what Joseph Smith said there was, right? But the point I'm making is the prior on being possible that there are variants that we don't have any direct textual evidence for should be quite high. And if you have reason for thinking that Joseph Smith is a genuine prophet, then there's not really a problem with thinking that he's going to tell you what those variations are, even in the absence of textual evidence. So I don't really see this as a problem for Mormonism. The issue for Mormonism is in establishing whether Joseph Smith is a genuine prophet, and there are many problems with that, particularly in regards to the translation of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham and some other issues, right? But this particular point that basically Joseph Smith wrote a modification of the Bible which says that he would be a prophet, according to Cameron. I still don't think he established that, but even if that's true, that's not actually a problem. It's not evidence that Joseph Smith was a prophet, right? But it's not really in any way inconsistent with that claim. It's dependent on you already accepting him as a prophet, right? And I've never heard anyone in my time of the church that I can ever remember appealing to anything in the Joseph Smith translation really as evidence that Joseph Smith was a prophet. They appealed to the Book of Mormon in doing that. Now, maybe some Mormons have done this elsewhere, right? But again, I don't think that was done at the time, and I'm not familiar with it being done now by many, if any, Mormons. And if Cameron is going to say that this is a claim that was made or propagated in the Mormon church, he should provide evidence for it, but he didn't. He just said that Joseph Smith used this as evidence for his prophethood. So I find this very, very confusing.
Our little test. There's 4 questions in this test, and they're each designed to test whether or not he's a true prophet. And again, we're going to perform the same exact test on Muhammad in just a couple minutes. Question 1. Did a previous prophet predict your coming? Smith's answer, yes. He claimed that Joseph, the son of Jacob, predicted his arrival and that the prophecy could be found in Genesis 50:33. As we've already seen, this is pretty problematic, but let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Question 2. Can we check this prophecy? Is there a record, some sort of record that we can verify? Smith's answer, unsurprisingly, no. He said the prophecy existed, but that it had been lost. And here's where things really start to fall apart for Joseph. If you open your Bible, even the King James Version, which was the most widely read Bible at that time, and turn to Genesis 50, you won't find verse 33. And you especially won't find a prophecy about Joseph Smith. In fact, if you check other ancient biblical manuscripts, the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, or even the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is no sign of this prophecy anywhere. It's completely absent. But it doesn't just stop there. Like if you check any source, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or even pagan historical records, there is no mention of this prophecy at all. It's not found in the Jewish tradition, in early Christian writings, or any of the pagan historical accounts that often interacted with the biblical text. This verse only shows up in Joseph Smith's own translation, which he produced in the 1830s. It's a verse that exists only because Smith himself added it. This is a ridiculously large red flag. Prophecies like Isaiah's prediction of the Messiah's virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14 or the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 were preserved across centuries, appearing in.
Well, hang on. We're jumping a few things there. Yeah. So just a quick check on this. So Cameron is referring to Genesis 50, 30 to 33 from the Joseph Smith translation, which does make a prophecy which could be reasonably interpreted as referring to Joseph Smith. The issue, my issue was whether Joseph Smith used this prophecy, which obviously he wrote, as evidence for his prophethood at the time, or whether Mormons subsequently have used this as evidence with anyone other than Mormons, right? Obviously, in a Mormon audience, there'd be no problem with appealing to this. But so that's the first citation needed. I understand this passage exists. I vaguely remember it having just checked it now. But what I don't remember is anyone using this as evidence for Joseph Smith's prophethood. It's more of a consequence of his prophethood that, well, we're able to get, as believing Mormons, we're able to get this alternate translation of the Bible, which then reveals things that previously had been lost. Okay. So that's fine, but what's the evidence that this is being used as evidence, either at the time Joseph Smith existed or Joseph Smith lived on now? Are Mormons using this as evidence for Joseph Smith's prophethood? Because I don't think anyone is. Again, they appeal to the Book of Mormon, right, as the evidence and other things. They don't appeal to the Joseph Smith translation, which isn't even the official biblical translation of the Bible that is even used in the church. So I think that Cameron is really putting way too much weight on this. Again, the claim is not that there's anything, even Cameron is not saying, as far as I can tell, well, he hasn't yet said, maybe he will, he has not yet said there's anything inconsistent about the existence of this prophecy. All he's saying is that it's not evidence that Joseph Smith is a prophet, for anyone who doesn't already believe that, which I completely agree with, and I think Mormons should agree with as well, right? My experience indicates that they do, because I don't think they use this as evidence for Joseph Smith's prophethood. So at the moment, we don't actually have an argument either way whether Joseph Smith is a prophet. We simply have a passage from the Joseph Smith translation which doesn't really give us evidence either way. So what's the problem here? It's evidence that I'm a prophet. Yeah, maybe. Anyway, so I'm really struggling to understand what the relevance of this is. Now, maybe we'll get some more on this, but then Cameron goes to talking about some passages about some passages from the Old Testament. Let me jump back a second here.
The biblical text. This verse only shows up in Joseph Smith's own translation, which he produced in the 1830s. It's a verse that exists only because Smith himself added it. This is a ridiculously large red flag. Prophecy.
But this is what I don't understand. What's the red flag about that? Why is that a red flag that a prophet retranslates some old text, and part of what they translate involves a prophecy of themselves? I just don't see that as a red flag, unless you know that is a mistranslation, which we don't, because we don't have anything like the original. I mean, when was Genesis written? It's generally thought to have been written by multiple authors over a period of a couple of centuries, but the canonical version of the text, I think, was finalized, I don't know, a few hundred years before Christ. Someone in the chat will know in more detail. I don't know exactly when the time was, but we don't have full text of it for centuries after the text is thought to have been finalized. So we don't definitively know what the text said, right? So we can't prove that it didn't say what it says in the JST. Now, again, I don't think it did say what the JST says it says, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, then it's not obvious what the problem is with him producing this translation. I don't see what the red flag is. I'm not sure what the problem is supposed to be. In fact, there's even precedent for this, because there are many instances can't think of any off the top of my head, but look this up. There are many cases in the New Testament where Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, but he misquotes it. He quotes it differently to what any version of the text that we know actually is. This is a little different because they're always paraphrasing or something, which, well, maybe. But Christians don't have any issue with this, right? So I don't understand why it's a red flag that a prophet retranslates an old text that we don't have the original of anymore and says, oh, by the way, there's a prophecy about me in here. If you thought that person was a prophet, then why not? Like, I don't see the issue.
Prophecies like Isaiah's prediction of the Messiah's virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14.
Right, and so then Cameron's comparing that to these prophecies these alleged prophecies from the Old Testament here. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. Right. So this is a prophecy about the Messiah. The trick here with many of these prophecies is, of course, how to establish whether these things actually were true of Jesus or were just written of him after the fact. Like, how do you actually? This is so stupid, right? It's okay. So the argument is, we have, in the case of Mormonism, Joseph Smith basically came up with new verses, which he said, "Hey, these are prophecies about me," and we can't verify whether these verses are true or not. We know that they're not in the oldest text, but we don't have the earliest originals, so all we can say is we don't really have any evidence for them. But I guess if you believe Joseph Smith, then you'll believe that, right? Now let's see what the Jesus case is. In the Jesus case, what we have is a claim, not actually by Jesus himself, but by people who wrote about him in the New Testament, that he was born of a virgin. Now, we don't have any ability to test that ourselves. We don't have any independent corroborating evidence that he was born of a virgin. Indeed, it seems pretty implausible that he was, because that doesn't really happen very often. But okay, then I guess you'll believe that he was born of a virgin. So it seems to be exactly paralleling here. We can't verify if what it says in the New Testament about Jesus was true, or where that information came from. And so the fact that it allegedly fulfills an Old Testament prophecy is sort of irrelevant, because we can't verify the information. In the case of Joseph Smith, we can't verify whether Joseph Smith's translation of the verses in question from Genesis is correct or not. So again, it's sort of irrelevant from an evidentiary point of view, because we can't verify it either way. All you can say is, if you believe Joseph Smith, then you'll believe the translation. If you don't, then you won't. It's exactly the same. Like, I don't understand how Cameron can't see the almost precise parallel here, that there's no way to independently verify the information about the JSC translation of this section from Genesis or the virgin birth. So and at the same time, we can't prove or disprove them either way. So you'll just believe them if you believe the people who make that claim based on other reasons, and you won't believe them if you don't. It's a precise parallel, and my guess is that we're going to see the same parallel apply in the case of Muhammad. But I guess we'll get to that. It just kind of boggles the mind here that Cameron thinks that Christianity, or like Catholicism, I guess specifically, is up here and Mormonism is down here, when at least on this specific point, they're at exactly the same. Like the analysis is exactly the same of this specific point, and I think this applies elsewhere as well. But focusing on this point here, I don't know how we can't see that there's information that you'll only believe if you already accept the claims of the prophets in question, because it cannot be independently verified. But yet, one side it's a red flag, and the other case it's a genuine prophecy. What? Jeez. Sorry, just having a quick look at chat here. Yeah, 6th century BC. That's sort of what I thought of, roughly as well. The point is that we certainly don't have any complete text going back that far, so we don't know what it originally said. If you believe in Joseph Smith, then what's the problem in thinking that those passages are genuine? Just like if you believe in what it says in the Gospels, what's the problem in thinking that Jesus was born of a virgin? But at the same time, there's no independent evidence for it. It's exactly parallel.
Or the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 were preserved across centuries, appearing in multiple sources, whether Jewish, Christian, or secular. But Joseph Smith's prophecy, it doesn't appear anywhere outside of his own translation. Joseph Smith's answer to question.
Yeah, and where does the evidence for a virgin birth appear outside of the New Testament? That's exactly the same parallel. I know he's going to say, yeah, but the prophecy about it occurred beforehand, but that's actually not the issue. The problem is not whether someone prophesied that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Actually, I don't know that that's the way that Jews understand it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, that's how Christians interpret it. The question is whether Jesus was born of a virgin, right? And that we don't have any information about. So this is what I was saying before. So if a prophecy is known about beforehand, then the issue is you can conform the events to the prophecy. If a prophecy is not known about beforehand, then the problem is that the prophecy could be invented. And what we're seeing here is, in the Joseph Smith case, the concern is, well, maybe the prophecy is invented by Joseph Smith, right? And if you believe in Joseph Smith, then you'll think, no, it's genuine. If you don't believe in him, you'll think he invented it, right? In the Jesus case, the only real difference that I can see is that the question is not about the prophecy. The question is about whether the prophecy was fulfilled. So if you believe in Jesus, you'll think, yeah, there was a virgin birth. And if you don't, you'll just think, no, that was invented to fit the prophecy. So other than other than which event is being invented, is it the prophecy itself or is it the fulfillment of the prophecy? That's the only difference. In every other respect, it's exactly the same. And I think that it's not that hard to see this, but it seems like Cameron doesn't want to see this parallel. He wants to see them being different, whereas in fact they are not.
Question 2 is extremely alarming, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt and move on to the next question. Question 3, is there another way that we can confirm this prophecy?
This is
Smith's
what I'm
answer,
saying.
yes. He claimed that God had re-revealed this lost prophecy to him personally. And this isn't necessarily unusual for Smith. He often claims special revelations. For example, in the Book of Mormon, Smith claimed to have received golden plates from an angel, which were then conveniently taken back to heaven, leaving no evidence behind. In this case, Smith said that although the prophecy had been lost, God gave it back to him through divine revelation. This now brings us to our fourth and final question. Question 4, who told you about this prophecy? Smith's answer, me. Joseph Smith claimed that God re-revealed the prophecy directly to him and no one else. Here's the point, okay? No true prophet would actually answer me to question number 4. It's an absolute watertight, nailed down, ironclad sign of a fake prophet. Anyone who answers me to question number 4 has forever disqualified themselves from being a true prophet. No matter.
So, but isn't this famously Jesus' answer to everything? Like when people ask Jesus, like, you know, yeah, this is. I'm just trying to articulate this point because it's sort of obvious. Jesus said, "I am the way," like, etc. Like, and all the other equivalent things that he said, which is more than Joseph Smith claimed for himself. Joseph Smith certainly had an ego, but he never claimed to be God. So I'm kind of unsure here about. I don't understand what Cameron is. I'm trying to have to think through this. So Cameron is saying that no genuine prophet would ever claim that. What's he? I need to listen to it again because I don't understand the logic. Maybe I'm just slow. What would a true prophet never say?
Lost. God gave it back to him through divine revelation. This now brings us to our fourth and final question. Question 4. Who told you about this prophecy? Smith's answer, me. Joseph Smith.
So he seems to be concerned about the idea of how do we know about a prophecy? Not the fulfillment, the original prophecy itself.
Claimed that God re-revealed the prophecy directly to him and no one else. Here's the point, okay? No true prophet would actually answer me to question number 4.
I think he's sort of mixing his metaphors here because the question was, who told you about this prophecy? So no true prophet would say that a prophecy made about them was also revealed by them. I don't see why. I mean, this comes back to the issue we were talking about before. Obviously, if you are a prophet claimant and you say, hey, there was a prophecy about me, and you ask, well, where can I find that prophecy? And they say, well, I'll tell you what the prophecy was. You won't find it anywhere else, but I can tell you, and I can also then tell you that I'm the fulfillment. Now, obviously, that's not convincing, right? It's not convincing to anyone who doesn't already believe they're a prophet. So maybe that's all Cameron is saying here. Maybe what he means when he says no true prophet will say that is just that obviously that's not actually evidence for someone being a prophet. But my point is that there's no obvious problem with that. Every religious tradition makes claims that no one will accept outside of people within that tradition. And so the fact that, in addition to many of the other things that he claimed, Joseph Smith also claimed to receive revelation about previous prophecies that had been made about him, I don't in any way see as suspicious or problematic. They are non-evidential with respect to his prophethood, absolutely, but I don't see that they're evidence against either. I just think that they're not evidence either way. Cameron seems to think that counts as evidence against, but I'm struggling to understand why. Yeah, so I guess this is the point here. Cameron is saying that it's suspicious the prophecy was clearly invented and spread wholesale by Joseph Smith. Well, I questioned before whether it was spread much by Joseph Smith at the time, because I don't know how much this was actually talked about. But okay, yes, he did, invent it, not by another prophet. So the fact is not disputed that Joseph Smith originated this. The question is it suspicious that a genuine prophet would, produce a new prophecy about themselves? I just fail to see why that's suspicious. Maybe I'm just missing something obvious here, but what's suspicious about that? I don't see it as any more suspicious than someone saying, "I am God." What is why is one suspicious and the other not? I'm really not following there. Maybe there's, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that Cameron's expecting this to be obvious to people, but to me, it's not obvious why one is more suspicious than the other. To me, they're both kind of sus claims. Really, anyone claiming special connection to God, I regard that as pretty suspicious, regardless of whether they say, I am God, or hey, there was a prophecy that God made about me, but you never heard about it before, or this is the word directly from God, which I am reciting, like Jesus, Joseph Smith and Mohammed, right? Any of those things are suspicious to me. I don't really see that one is more suspicious than the other. I think it's a bit fishy because the supposed prophet has a vested interest in people believe him. Yeah, but that's true for anything any prophet says, right? Any prophet wants people to believe him, and so they will attempt to convince you by various means, either appealing to previous prophecies or perhaps miracles or alleged miracles, or by witness of the Spirit, or by the beauty of the work you produce itself. That's what Muslims claim. Whatever it is, they're always trying to convince you, and they'll always appeal to criteria which they themselves are, like, they set those criteria. So I don't, or passages they interpret. For example, to me, it's just as suspicious that the only people who think that prophecies made in Isaiah, like the suffering servant, the only people who interpret that as being about the Messiah, the only people who interpret those passages about the Messiah as referring to Jesus are early Christians. And the way they interpret them, like, for example, the idea that the Messiah would be killed and crucified and resurrected for our sins, that is nowhere in the Old Testament unless you ask Christians. Like, Jews never thought that this was in the Old Testament and still don't. And there's no record prior to Christians of people believing anything like this. It only comes afterwards. So to me, this is exactly the same thing. It's just that, yeah, the record of the words are there, but the interpretation that's subsequently given to them is completely absent until after Jesus. I don't see that as less suspicious than Joseph Smith coming up with a prophecy about himself, especially when it doesn't really seem that Joseph Smith used this as evidence for himself in any significant way. He used the Book of Mormon as evidence for himself. Yeah, this is sort of my point. What prophet doesn't do that in different ways? I don't know. Maybe I'm the weird one. I don't see any red flag here, or maybe a different way of putting this would be that if this is insofar as this is a red flag against Joseph Smith, it's a red flag against every other kind of prophet claimant ever. I don't see Jesus as coming out ahead here, to put it another way.
An absolute watertight, nailed down, ironclad sign of a fake prophet. Anyone who answers me to question number 4 has forever disqualified themselves from being a true prophet. No matter like what else they've ever claimed or said or done, they're fake. They're out.
Why?
So here's why. Joseph Smith is claiming that God oversaw and approved the following sequence of events. Number 1, God decides that Joseph Smith is the chosen prophet, and to make sure everyone knows this, he has Joseph, the son of Jacob, foretell Smith's arrival thousands of years in advance. The prophecy is then written down in the Jewish scriptures for everyone to see. 2,
okay, but this is the problem here, because I don't think that Mormons say this. So they don't say, well, the first thing they do, God decides that Joseph Smith is the chosen prophet. Yeah, okay, they do believe that. To make sure everyone knows, he has Joseph, son of Jacob, foretell Smith's arrival thousands of years in advance. So Mormons also believe that Joseph did foretell that, but it's this clause here to make sure everyone knows. So I don't think Mormons do believe that. I certainly never believed that, and it's precisely because that prophecy was lost. So the reason God made that wasn't so everyone knew. I'm not sure exactly what Mormons would tell you about why Joseph made that prophecy, but it wasn't so that everyone would know, because they obviously didn't have access to that prophecy. So it was for some other reason. Perhaps it was just as something that would be relevant to the people at the time, like Joseph, son of Jacob, and then people in the latter days, as Mormons would say, who would then have it revealed to them again. It wasn't for people in between, so to speak, who didn't know about it. And again, I think that seems to be crucial to Cameron's argument here, because if you take out that clause, then all we have is that God decides Joseph Smith is a prophet, and then we have Jacob foretold about the arrival about Joseph Smith thousands of years before. And there's sort of no, well, I guess we'll put the pieces there here. So let me.
Somehow God's people completely forget about this prophecy. Despite generations of reverence for the scriptures and their prophets, the foretelling of the world-changing Joseph Smith vanishes from memory somehow. No scrolls, no records, nothing remains.
Well, that's not very convincing, Cameron, because we know that there are lots of things that have been changed in the scriptures. I mean, the obvious example would be, what is the original ending of Mark? we don't seem to be able to agree on that, despite the fact that the timelines there are much shorter than in the case of the Old Testament. When in the case of Genesis, we really have no idea who wrote them or when, much less even than we know about the New Testament. So this idea that somehow God's people completely forget about this prophecy, yeah, because the scripture was changed. Like that's what Mormons believe. I mean, maybe you don't believe in the whole idea of the apostasy, right? Which is what Mormons believe, that the sort of truth was lost. But this is the thing: if you don't accept, and then it was restored by Joseph Smith, maybe you think that that's implausible for various reasons, right? And that seems to be what Cameron's appealing to here. But the issue is, if you don't accept that, then you're not going to accept Mormonism anyway. Mormonism is predicated on the idea that the truth was lost. Like some parts of the truth remain, but the full truth was lost from the earth for many hundreds of years. And the restoration under Joseph Smith is what brought it back. If you reject the idea that there was a loss of the full truth, then you're just never going to accept Joseph Smith. It doesn't even make sense on the face of it. On the other hand, if you do accept the restoration, then there's just no problem with Joseph Smith finding some parts of the Bible that had been lost, especially when we have no contrary evidence that these existed. We don't have evidence that they did exist, but we don't have contrary evidence either. And we know that there have been lots of aspects of the Bible that have been lost or changed. Now, I suppose some people would quibble about how much is lots, but I think more than enough to make the point, right? Again, what was the original ending of Mark as just one example of this? So yeah, a sort of Nicene Christian is not going to accept the logic of the Great Apostasy and then the Restoration, but that's really their argument against Mormonism. It's not this particular passage, like that. The passage is just not doing any work here, right? It's other prior beliefs and background knowledge. The idea that there are passages or segments of the Bible that were lost is just shouldn't be disputed. Like that just happened, right? We know that happened. We have textual evidence of that happening. Compare the King James Version translation, which relied on texts that were available in the 16th century, to modern translations, which incorporate changes based on new texts that have been discovered. And then recall that even the most recent findings, like textual findings, still generally date from centuries after the originals were actually written. And so it would sort of be almost impossible to think that there weren't further changes that happened over time. And that's for the New Testament, even more so for the Old Testament. So the prior just shouldn't be too low here on this specific point, that it's possible that there were changes. And I don't see, Cameron basically seems to believe that that's implausible because those sorts of changes are just not things. They're not things that he believes in because of his beliefs about the Bible. But that's not really anything to do with Joseph Smith. That's his beliefs about the Bible that are doing all the work there.
Number 3, but God still wants people to believe in Joseph Smith, so he decided to re-reveal this prophecy because
No, see, again, this is not true. So it's true that God wants people to believe in Joseph Smith. It's not true that in order to do that, he re-revealed the prophecy. Again, what's the evidence that Mormons then or now use this in a substantive way as evidence for Joseph Smith's prophethood? I don't think they do, right? They use other things as evidence. They don't use this. They talk about this sometimes. I vaguely remember, as I said, when I reread the passage, about reading this at some point, but it's not even their official translation of the Bible, and it's not something they use to appeal to non-Christians, at least to non-Mormons, in any significant way. So I think that this is a straw man. It's not true that they use this, that he wants people. Sorry, it's not true that God decided to re-reveal the prophecy so that people believed in Joseph Smith. Right? Mormons would say no. God revealed the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith so that people would believe in him, plus the first vision and a few other things. Not this particular prophecy.
Been lost.
Oh dear, I just read the second part, but instead of revealing it to historian scholars and other people who could verify it, well, that's going to be a problem for a lot of Christianity. Actually,
but instead of revealing it to historians or scholars or even just other people that could verify it, 4, God re-reveals the prophecy directly to Joseph Smith. God's big plan to verify Joseph Smith as a true prophet of God.
No, it's not. Again, that isn't his big plan. His big plan is, God's big plan, as Mormons believe it, is that God reveals the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith, and that establishes his prophethood. Again, with some other things as well, like the three witnesses and the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and some other miracles and his life. They say it's a cumulative case, right? It's the same crap that we get from Christian apologists. I'm not saying these are good, right? What I'm trying to establish is not a defense of Mormonism, I hope that should be obvious. What I'm trying to do is establish a fair point of comparison between mainstream Christianity and Mormonism. And I think that when you do that, you see that the evidence for them both is equally bad, right? Or at least on this level, right? That there's more explicit evidence of non-historicity in the case of the Book of Mormon than the Bible, but that's not what we're looking at now. If Cameron was saying that God revealed the Book of Mormon, but the Book of Mormon is full of historical inaccuracy, then I would agree with him, right? But that's not what he's saying. He's saying that God's plan was to establish Joseph Smith's prophethood by re-revealing this prophecy. But that just isn't the case. Like he hasn't presented any evidence, and I'm not aware of any evidence of Mormons claiming that this is, in any significant sense, evidence of Joseph Smith being a prophet. They say the Book of Mormon is. They don't say that this translation of a passage from Genesis in the JST is. So I think that Cameron's just making things up. What's his evidence that this is that any of the key points here about that this is how Joseph Smith is established as being a prophet are true? He just states them. This actually really annoys me, right? Because it's a type of lying that is insidious, because in each of these points here, most of what he says is true, but there's just bits that I think are incorrect. So, for example, if you look at point 3 here, God still wants people to believe in Joseph Smith, so he decides to re-reveal the prophecy. If you take that sentence, most of that Mormons would say is correct about God's intentions, right? Because the point about all of this is that this is what Mormons believe, right? But Mormons don't, because Mormons do think that God wants to believe in Joseph Smith, and they do think that he revealed the prophecy. So most of that first sentence there is true from a Mormon point of view. But what's wrong, I argue, and Cameron hasn't established to the contrary, is Mormons do not say that God re-revealed the prophecy so that for the purpose of people believing in Joseph Smith, which is sort of the really substantial claim there. And you really can only see that if you read it carefully and link the clauses together. So I think that Cameron is basically telling a fib there, or he's just been, oops, I didn't mean to do that, or he's just being very sloppy with his research here, because he hasn't established that claim, for example, in the first sentence of 3 there is true. He's given no evidence for that. He's only given evidence that the prophecy existed in the Joseph Smith translation. Well, in fact, he didn't actually do that, but I accept that that's true. It would be nice to have a screenshot or something, but actually maybe he couldn't. I don't know if, yeah, maybe that would have been somewhat problematic, because you can't actually find, it's only would be in the footnote of the online version of the scriptures, right? So maybe it wouldn't look as good there if it was just shown in footnote. I don't know, but there's probably a version you can find that it's not in a footnote, so he could have shown us that. The point is, though, Cameron is not reporting this accurately. He's misrepresenting the Mormon position in order to make it seem less plausible than it is. Not that it's plausible, but this isn't the problem, right? The problem is not that Joseph Smith came up with a prophecy about himself. The problem is that Joseph Smith, the basis of his prophethood was primarily the translation of the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon has a bunch of issues, right? That's the primary problem, in my opinion. And because that's the claim that Mormons make, is the Book of Mormon provides the evidence, but the Book of Mormon is lacking in many respects. So that is, I think, how you respond to that claim. You don't respond to that by making up this idea that this particular prophecy that Joseph Smith came up with is core to the Mormon's claim of Joseph Smith's prophethood, and then saying that, well, that's obviously not something a real prophet would do, because it's just not the case that this was ever or is today regarded as a critical underpinning, a core piece of evidence, the way that God would reveal to humanity that Joseph Smith was a prophet. It's just not the case. Cameron's just made this up. Cameron, what's your evidence for this? What's your evidence that Mormons believe that God wanted people to believe in Joseph Smith, and therefore he re-revealed the prophecy? Who says that?
Is to have the very guy the prophecy is about say, hey guys, I mean, I was for sure foretold. I mean, you just got to trust me on this, because I mean, well, only I know about it because God told me directly, guys. Just like,
yeah, and I should also, I mean, I sort of mentioned this before, but also the other point is that this is exactly, well, not quite exactly, but almost exactly what happened in the case of Jesus. Yes, there are passages in the Old Testament which Jesus didn't make up, although sometimes he misquotes them, Jesus as well as the gospel authors. But no one up until them interpreted them in the way that Christians now do, right? Again, the idea that the Messiah would be crucified for our sins, for example. Where is that in the Old Testament in a way that, where's the evidence that the Old Testament was interpreted in that way prior to them? Again, this harkens back to what I said before, right? If there's a prophecy about a prophet, there's two potential concerns here. One is that the prophecy was not actually made beforehand, that the prophecy was made up after the fact. And that's the potential issue in Joseph Smith's case, right? And Cameron's saying, oh, that's a big problem, right? Because the prophecy was clearly made up after the fact. Yeah, okay. That is an issue if you're relying on that prophecy, but Mormons don't. So he hasn't really made the case there. The other concern, which somehow Cameron is just ignoring, is that the alleged fulfillment of the prophecy was tailored to the original prophecy. That can be done either by making the events happen in accordance with what they were predicted to be, or just by sort of asserting after the fact or reinterpreting the prophecy. So, for example, it was known that the Messiah was supposed to be from Nazareth, so people just sort of said that Jesus was actually born in, hang on, I think I'm getting this wrong. Jesus was supposed to be born, okay, let me get this right. The Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, but everyone knew that Jesus was from Nazareth. So they made up this implausible story that his family was originally from Nazareth, and then they went to Bethlehem. They went to Bethlehem to be registered for the tax, which was never a thing, and it's completely ridiculous that the tax registration for tax would ever work that way. And then they went back to where they lived, and that's why Jesus grew up. Like, they invent this ridiculous story, which is obvious nonsense, and we have no corroborating evidence for, to clearly just to fit with the prophecy about the Messiah, right? And then they invent all of this nonsense about, oh, well, actually, we did expect the Messiah would die because suffering servant or something like this, right? Again, none of these passages are interpreted like the Isaiah stuff. Jews don't accept the Christian interpretation of those passages. It's all fitted after the fact by Christians looking back and making sure that Jesus fits with the prophecies about the Messiah, right? So this is exactly the same problem. It's just from a looking backwards point of view instead of sort of looking forwards point of view. The problem is not that the prophecy was manufactured after the event. The problem is that the events were refactored and reinterpreted to fit the prophecy. They're both equally as problematic if you're using prophecy to verify prophethood. They're just different ways of doing it, right? And the issue here is that Cameron isn't applying inconsistent standards. If you want to give Christians the benefit of the doubt and say, look, we don't have any evidence that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin birth, right? Or we don't have any evidence that he wasn't actually born in Bethlehem. Okay, I think those things are implausible, but yeah, we can't definitively prove that. But likewise, we don't have any evidence that the original texts of Genesis didn't say what Joseph Smith said that they do. Right? Like, if you're going to make the one argument, you have to accept the other because they're appealing to the exact same principle here that we don't have evidence to the contrary. There's some background knowledge that we could appeal to, but we don't actually have clear evidence to the contrary. So all it comes down to really is, do you accept the claim of prophethood, or I guess divinity in the case of Jesus? If you do, then you're going to accept the other claims that they made, and if you don't, then you're not going to, right? But Cameron is not accepting that because he wants to give, like, mainstream Christianity, well, he puts it on a pedestal, right? And so it just gets different treatment. He doesn't see all of the problems with them appealing to Old Testament prophecy and all of the reinterpretations and clear fitting to the evidence gerrymandering. But then the fact that Joseph Smith makes a prophecy about himself is somehow knockdown proof that he wasn't a prophet. It's baffling to me. It's just clear motivated reasoning as far as I'm concerned.
Like, guys, just trust me, guys. Okay, look, if we believe that God is not a complete moron, we would see that God would not do this. Like, he wouldn't set things up in this way. It completely defeats the purpose of the foretelling.
Yeah, this is a good way to say it. Nowhere, man. Cameron is saying that this JST prophecy about Joseph Smith is the Mormons' evidence for Joseph Smith's prophethood. But what Mormons actually say is that this is an entailment of their evidence that Joseph Smith is a prophet. More or less, I think that that's correct, right? They would say the evidence that Joseph Smith is a prophet is his life, his works, his ministry, primarily the Book of Mormon, and you pray and you get a witness of the test of the Holy Spirit, and then there's the 3 and the 2 and the 8 witnesses and all that other stuff. Primarily the Book of Mormon, then plus this other stuff, right? Cumulative case, blah blah blah. That's what Mormons will say. Well, that's what they should say. I generally do say, right? I mean, Mormons, like anyone else, sometimes they say funny things, but that's typically the argument, right? That's the church's position. An entailment of that is, hey, Joseph Smith made these other retranslations and things of the Bible, and one of those was a prophecy about himself. Now, again, so obviously you're not going to accept that if you don't accept that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and I don't think that is what Genesis originally said. But it's a big difference from saying this is an entailment of your worldview from this is the evidence for it.
And that's what Cameron's misrepresenting here. And he doesn't give a shred of evidence in favor of the idea that Mormons are using this as evidence for their worldview in any significant, substantive way. And nor is he really explaining how it's fundamentally different from all of the things that I just said about the New Testament and Jesus.
In the first place. And then it also makes Joseph Smith indistinguishable from a fake prophet. God would never send a true prophet with the message, guys, I was foretold, but only I know about it. Because a fake prophet could do the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's true, but that's not what. Again, Mormons don't say that. They don't say that's the evidence of his prophethood. Jesus evidently went. By the way, I don't actually believe this, right? But most Christians believe that Jesus went around saying he is God. I don't actually believe that Jesus did say that, because I think he would have been stoned to death immediately if that had ever happened. And the New Testament comes up with some very implausible scenarios to avoid that having happened. But the point is, Christians believe that that's what he said. Now, how can anyone possibly verify that Jesus was, just on the basis of, like, you're standing there and he says, oh, I am the way and the light, or something like that, right? How could you possibly verify that? It's just him saying it. And then appealing to some prophecies that evidently he's like, appealing to some prophecies that he's then reinterpreting, or other people are saying, oh, he was born in Bethlehem. Well, how do you know he was born in Bethlehem? The point is, it's exactly the same thing. The guy comes along and makes a bunch of claims which you cannot independently verify. And so you have to either believe them or not, right? On the basis of your background beliefs and your feelings, I don't know, whatever, right? But you cannot independently verify these claims. It's just exactly the same in the case of Joseph Smith and Jesus. And again, my defense of Mormonism is not a defense of Mormonism, because I think the evidence for Mormonism is really bad. But what I'm saying is, so is the evidence for Christianity. And in this respect, I think they're exactly equal. Some guy comes along and tells you he's God. The other guy comes along and tells you he's a special messenger of God who's destroying the gospel. How do you know either of them is correct? And unless they tell you something that you can independently verify, and that there's no way that they could have, or no plausible way they could have known that, unless their claim is true, which just doesn't really happen, then you can't know. I mean, there is way that Jesus could have done this, right? He could have told us the thousandth decimal of pi, which was impossible to know at the time, but could have been verified later. I don't know that that's perfect, because maybe you could have come up with some way that, well, maybe they had this lost knowledge that they could calculate it. Seems implausible, but at least it would be pretty strong evidence that there's something special about him. But we don't ever have things like that you can actually verify. It's always things that you can't verify, or reinterpretations of old prophecies. You just kind of have to accept their interpretation of it, which amounts to the same thing. Exact parallel here. What Cameron is doing is, on the one hand, presenting the Mormon case very, very implausibly and very unfaithfully to what Mormons actually believe, and then on the other hand, not applying the same standards to mainstream Christianity. So that's how he gets this sort of alleged asymmetry between the two. Whereas, in fact, as I've argued, that they're in exactly the same evidentiary position in this particular respect. Yeah, I know there's some things in the Book of Mormon which you can clearly show are ahistorical, which isn't the same thing as the Bible. I'm not talking about that, right? We're talking about evidence of prophethood from the point of view of, like, prophecies, okay? Because I know people are going to say that in the comments. They're going to be like, oh, but it mentions horses in the Americas and things like that in the Book of Mormon. Yeah, I know that. I'm not talking about that. I'm specifically talking about the aspect of prophecies and predictions, which is what Cameron's video is focused on. And in that sense, both of their religious traditions involve people making claims about their status that cannot be independently verified, and rely on prophecies, which either you don't know about, or you can't verify what they said, or you can't verify that they were in fact fulfilled. And so there's no difference here.
This is why Joseph Smith disqualifies himself. He claims a prophecy about him was foretold, but then the only record of this prophecy is his own word. Guys, this is not...
Jesus claims that prophecies about him were foretold, but the only record of the fact that these prophecies were fulfilled is Jesus's word himself, or the word of his followers. It's exactly the same. How can you not see this? Like, the virgin birth is probably the best example of this, because how would anyone know? There's only one person on earth who would know whether this is true, right? Unless it was revealed to them, but obviously that's going to get circular. and that's Mary, right? So the only way Jesus could have known this is if Mary told him, or God revealed it to him. But, like, we're talking about a corroborating evidence, right? So this is a really good parallel here, because Jesus comes along and says, well, actually, I don't know if Jesus ever said this, right? But his followers said it, right? So to me, this amounts to the same thing. It sort of doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to simplify it. Jesus says, hey, I was born of a virgin. And people are like, wow, that's cool. How can we check that? Trust me, bro, my mum said. Like, that's his evidence. Okay, Joseph Smith says, hey, I was foretold by the authors of Genesis. How do we know that? Well, I retranslated it, so trust me, bro. Like, what's the difference? What is the difference?
Not intelligent. This is extremely dumb. All right, let's now move
Yeah,
across
it
the
is dumb.
world.
I
Let's go
agree.
to
But
7.
Cameron is not applying the same standards to Christianity. That's the issue. He's not applying the same standards. And he's also misrepresenting the Mormon position, because Mormons don't use this in any substantive, significant way as evidence for Joseph Smith. It's just a corollary, a consequence. Yeah, he also God also prophesied, because Joseph Smith was able to, tell us that. But they're not so stupid as to recognize that no one else is going to accept that. And so they appeal to other things. And yeah, those other things are bad as well. But that's the case for any religious apologetics. But the point is, at least you got to get you can't misrepresent the position. But that's the point. And Cameron gave zero evidence that Joseph Smith at the time, or Mormons now, appeal to this as evidence. I mean, I keep saying this, right? But it's sort of crucial. Either Cameron doesn't know how to do basic research, or he's just lying to you. So which of, I suppose it's both. It could be both. Which do you think is more plausible? I guess I'll leave that to you.
Century Arabia, and this is the time of Muhammad, who would go on to found Islam. Like Joseph, he claimed to be a true prophet, the final messenger sent by God, not just to his own people, but to all of humanity. But Muhammad didn't just stop there. He also claimed that Jesus himself had foretold his coming. Muhammad said that Jesus, the very figure revered by Christians and known by secular historians for hundreds of years, had prophesied his arrival. According to Muhammad, Jesus predicted that a future messenger would come after him, and his name would be Ahmed, which is basically just a variant of Muhammad's name. This claim was codified in Surah 61:6 of the Quran, which we'll take a look at in just a second. So let's put Muhammad's claim through the same 4-question test that we used for Joseph Smith. Question 1. Did a previous prophet predict your coming? Muhammad's answer, yes. He claimed that Jesus, the son of Mary, foretold his coming by name. In Surah 61:6 of the Quran, Jesus is quoted as saying, I am truly Allah's messengers to you, confirming the Torah which came before me and giving good news of a messenger after me whose name will be Ahmed. Now, obviously, this is questionable, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, just like we did Joseph, and move on to the next question. Question number 2. Can we check this prophecy? Is there a record that we can verify? Muhammad's answer, no. I was foretold in these exact words by Jesus. However, all records of these exact words have disappeared. There is no document and no memories of this foretelling. We should actually take a moment and talk about how ridiculous this is from a historical standpoint.
What proportion of the words of Jesus do you think were well, I guess there's two ways to look at this question. What proportion of the words that are attributed to Jesus in the New Testament do you think he actually said? And then conversely, what proportion of the words that Jesus actually said are recorded in the New Testament? Now, it's that latter question that I'm interested in here. And the answer clearly has to be only a tiny fraction, right? When Jesus' ministry is supposed to have lasted 3 years, and I think that the total amount of text attributed to him as quotes is not that extensive, right? I don't know exactly how much it is, but it's certainly a lot less than you'd say in 3 years of the public ministry. So again, what is exactly supposed to be the problem with Jesus saying something about his this prophecy about Jesus? Sorry, what is the problem supposed to be about Jesus making this prophecy about Muhammad and it not being recorded? I don't see the issue. Obviously, only a Muslim's going to believe this, right? Because we don't have any corroborating evidence. But it comes back to the same point. Only a Christian is going to believe in the virgin birth or the divinity of Jesus, or the interpretations they give to the various messianic passages in the Old Testament. No one else before or since has ever accepted those interpretations or those other claims, and there's no corroborating evidence for them. You just believe it if you believe in the religious tradition or the claims of that person, or you don't if you don't. And it's the same thing with this prophecy about Muhammad. It's the same thing with the prophecy regarding Joseph Smith. Cameron is just, by the way, I don't know how significant how much importance Muslims give to this prophecy. And I was able to give that commentary from a Mormon point of view because I have that background. I don't know in the case of Muslims, so I won't comment on that. I would just say I don't trust Cameron to present the evidence accurately, but that's sort of by and by here, because the fundamental point is Cameron has not established the asymmetry that he wants to establish. The fundamental symmetry here is that in all cases, the prophet makes claims. The prophet makes claims in support of their prophethood, or in Jesus' case, his divinity. I guess he's a prophet as well, which cannot be independently verified. And so you accept them or you don't. Now, somehow that's a problem in the case of Mormonism and Islam, but it's not a problem in the case of Christianity. Well, Cameron would say, yeah, but the prophecies were written down beforehand. Well, that doesn't matter if you can't verify that they were fulfilled, like the virgin birth being a classic example, or the fact that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, two good examples. And B, it's also a problem if up until this point they were interpreted one way, and then only by the people in question are they interpreted a completely different way. So if you change the interpretation on them, that's basically just as good as making up the prophecy wholesale. Now, Cameron's going to say, no, the interpretation wasn't changed. It's just no one realized it before then. Well, come on. And you're saying that it's implausible that that there were passages that were lost from Genesis, or there were sayings of Jesus that weren't recorded, that Mormons or Muslims appeal to. But at the same time, and that's too implausible to even consider, but at the same time, it's perfectly plausible that Jews right up until the time of Jesus didn't understand their own scriptures, and then it was only Jesus and his followers that were able to correctly understand them. That's perfectly plausible to you. Can we not see the obvious double standard here? If Jesus said that, he could have avoided a lot of confusion about Islam by stressing that Surah was recorded by pre-Islamic sources. Yeah, well, Jesus could have avoided a lot of confusion about a lot of things if he just said it more clearly. The problem is getting an argument like that to work that doesn't also undercut claims that Christians want to support. So I don't accept arguments like that. Well, in principle, I could accept them, right? But the claims just never work when you fool them out, when you follow them to the logical conclusion. Like, well, it's a bit suspicious that such an important thing wasn't recorded and passed down. Yeah, maybe it is, but isn't it equally suspicious, everything that I just said about the Jesus tradition, like that we can't verify any of these key claims, and that none of the alleged prophecies were interpreted in their way up to that time, and it was only after the fact that all these doctrines just changed to fit the evidence of what actually happened to Jesus, like the idea that that there would be now sort of two resurrections. There's one that happens with Jesus and then the other that happens at the end of time, which was not something that was believed, or that the Messiah would die for our sins and would be resurrected, which is not something that was believed. And that all of these passages about from Isaiah and whatever applied to Jesus in various ways, it was not how they were interpreted before or since by Jews. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That's just as equally implausible. And then what about all of the doctrinal issues that Christians have still not been able to agree with themselves about? Maybe if Jesus was just a little clearer about this, then we could have avoided all of these problems. Like, for example, if Jesus said ever once explicitly taught, by the way, slavery is morally wrong, don't have slaves. You should eliminate slavery from society as soon as you can, right? Slavery bad, abolish it. Pro-abolitionism, slavery is never acceptable, no ifs, buts, or maybes. If he just kind of said that, we could have avoided some problems, right? I mean, probably people would have still ignored it, I think, but it would have been more difficult than what we actually have, which is, I don't really think Jesus said much of anything about slavery. Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. Or was it Jesus who said that? Doesn't really matter. The point is, if you're going to say, well, it's a bit suspicious that these things weren't recorded, it's just as equally suspicious that all these other things weren't recorded, that is just as problematic for Christianity. So my point here is, if we're going to engage in that sort of reasoning, it needs to be applied consistently to the different, competing traditions or different religious traditions. You can't just apply that sort of logic to one and then ignore it when it applies to the other. And that's what I think Cameron is doing here. And honestly, that's what apologists always do. Like, they just apply inconsistent standards to favor their own belief point of view.
Point. Let's start with the New Testament, which was written within 10 to 40 years of Jesus' death by people who either knew him directly or were close to the disciples. These are very, very early sources, much closer to the actual events than the Quran. You would expect something as monumental as a prophecy of a future prophet named Ahmed to at least appear in these very early documents. But as we examine the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find nothing. There's no mention of a...
So why would you expect that? So it seems that your expectations about what the well, okay, there's actually two issues here, right? So one is, why would you expect that prophecy be made? Now, that's going to depend on what you expect about the future and what you think God does and is likely to do and what his purposes are. The other thing is that Muslims do believe that such a prophecy was made. They just believe that it was lost. And so it comes back to the question again about whether you think that the early church accurately or sufficiently accurately preserved the original text of, say, the Gospels. That's obviously going to be a long discussion. I think I just need to point to the short ending of Mark, right? Which the oldest versions of Mark that we have don't say anything about the resurrected Jesus. It just says that the women found the tomb empty and they were afraid and they ran away, and that's where it ends, right? So there's sort of two possibilities there, and neither of them are very helpful for Cameron in this case. Either the original version of Mark had a longer ending that did include the resurrection of Jesus, which obviously is sort of the most central claim of Christianity. So I don't think you can argue, oh, he just didn't feel like putting it in. Well, come on. If that can be left out, then this prophecy about a future prophet can be left out, right? I think we can all agree that the resurrection of Jesus is more important than that, right, for Christianity. So either the original included it, but then it was lost. Well, if that can be lost, then so can this prophecy about a future prophet. On the other hand, maybe the original didn't include it, and then the longer endings were in fact added later. In which case, it is perfectly possible for really important things to just be left out. So I don't understand how Cameron can say this. Right? Regardless of what you think about Mark, whether you think originally there was a longer ending or not, either that shows that you can leave out the most important thing to Christianity, or the most important thing to Christianity can be lost. Now, yeah, it wasn't lost from all copies, but at least from enough so that we find variants that don't have it, right? And if that can go missing, then, well, what else that's much less important can go missing? So I'd actually be super interested to hear what Cameron would have to say about that, because his claim is that something this important would definitely be recorded. Well, in fact, Muslims think that it was, right? So that's kind of a silly argument. The key thing is, would something this important be lost? The answer seems to be that it could be, because the resurrection can be lost from Mark, right? That there were peoples before any of the, I mean, I suppose it depends on what order you think the Gospels are written, but it seems most scholars think that Mark was written earliest. And even aside from that, early Christians wouldn't have had access to all of the different Gospels immediately. They were originally distributed to certain peoples and areas, right, until they were sort of combined together and then distributed collectively and sort of collated into an official version. The point is, there were early Christian communities who, as far as we can tell, only had that short version of Mark, at least at some times and places, right? So very important things can either be left out or lost. And that's just one example. There are others, but that's probably the clearest one that I'm aware of. This is actually, thanks Texas Liberal, that's another good example. 500 people coming out of the grave and walking them around. If that really happened, you'd think someone might have mentioned this, other than, I think it's Matthew. I think that's correct, as to the only place where it's mentioned. And they come up with all sorts of excuses as to why that's not the case. Well, look, if you cannot mention 500 people coming out of the ground and walking around, maybe you cannot mention this prophecy about a prophet coming, or that can be left out of recopyings. So again, what's my issue here? It's an issue of inconsistent standards. I don't think that there was a prophecy about Muhammad, right? I'm not saying that's plausible, although we should accept it. My claim is that if we're going to assess a claim like this, we need to use consistent standards when we apply them across different cases or to different religious traditions. If you're going to say there's a problem with this prophecy about Muhammad because it's implausible that we wouldn't have it from other sources, then you should apply that same logic to other cases which are problematic for Christianity. And I think when you do, you realize that that argument is just as problematic it can't really, it's just as problematic with respect to Christianity and can't really be used in the way that Cameron wants to appeal to it. Because it will undercut things that he wants to accept, like it would undercut Christianity, or at least the evidence for it. And I think this is the fundamental problem with a lot of apologetics, is that it's an inability or refusal to apply the same rigorous standards to your own faith as you apply to others, or try to apply to others. I don't actually think Cameron's being that rigorous here, but you see what I'm saying. He just refuses to see that this exact same logic can be applied to undercut his own religious tradition and his own claims to establish Jesus as a prophet. And yeah, I think that this is really the issue with apologetics, because it's not enough that when you say something, what you're saying is true, right? It also has to be, in a sense, well, relevant, but it has to be fair. So an example would be, if you're comparing two political candidates and you list off all of the failures and flaws of one political candidate and then just stop there, all of those things you've said can be true, but fundamentally it's unfair, because if the whole point is assessing between two candidates, only looking at the flaws of one but not the other is obviously unfair. And in a sense, it's lying, right? It's lying by omission. If it's done deliberately, it could just be incompetence, but it's either lying by omission or incompetence, right? Because in order to conduct an appropriate comparison of them, you have to you should look at the pros and cons of both of them, not just the flaws. You should look at the benefits or the good things and the bad things, and you should do that for both of them. Doing it for one of them doesn't really help you to distinguish between them at all, or to compare them at all. Right? That's sort of obvious if I say it for a political candidate, and somehow it's less obvious when apologists do it, because what they do is they point out flaws and problems or alleged problems with other faith traditions or philosophical perspectives, but they just don't apply those same standards to their own religious tradition. I think it's clear that Cameron is not doing that in this video, and I think that the point that I'm trying to get to is that is what really gets to me about apologetics, is the either really sloppy standards or just intellectual dishonesty, whatever combination of those two that it is, I don't know. But either of those things run contrary to my fundamental values, which is careful scholarship, clear thinking, and applying like fair standards across the board to the positions you're trying to evaluate. And obviously, there's going to be disagreement about how you do that and what it looks like in different cases, but you've got to at least try to do that in a consistent way. And there's just seems to be no effort to do that here. When what would make a much more interesting video would be a comparison of Jesus versus Muhammad versus Joseph Smith, and we apply a consistent set of standards and see how they do. Now, I don't think that Cameron, we would agree, if we did do that, but at least, if he made a genuine effort to do that, and then apply the criteria and so forth, I could be like, okay, that's a reasonable approach. Let's discuss this. Whereas it doesn't appear that there was any effort to do that at all. You're saying a lot of apologetics is taking arguments out of context, right? Yeah, sort of what I'm saying. I'm saying if you don't provide an appropriate context for something that you're saying or arguing, then it can get to the point of just being a lie, right? Even if strictly speaking what you're saying is true. It can be, maybe you don't like the term lie, right? But deliberately deceptive, which is what I count as a lie, right? I would just call that a lie. So again, if you point out, if we have two political candidates and you say, look at all the problems with this one, and then you don't mention all the problems with the other one, that seems, and you're doing that deliberately in order to cast one in a better light than another, that seems to be deliberately deceptive. And I think that that's essentially what apologetics does a lot of the time. It does not apply the same standards to itself that it applies to others or other positions. Fair point, nowhere, man. I think we may have combined two different things. The 500 witnesses refers to Jesus appearing to a crowd of people, I think, during the Pentecost, like after the Pentecost or at some point there, one of the post-resurrection appearances. And yeah, I guess that's, anyway, one of the post-resurrection appearances. The number of dead coming out of the grave in Matthew was not specified. Yes, so that was my mistake, but the point still stands. That's the sort of thing that you would expect to be mentioned, but wasn't. So what's the issue here? Can we, if that's something that Cameron's going to appeal to as being evidence against Islam, how can we reconcile that with Christians believing these things that likewise seemingly are things that other people would have recorded?
Future prophet by this name or anything remotely like it at all. But that's not all. This period wasn't just limited to the New Testament writings, obviously. There were many people writing about Jesus during that time. We have early apostolic documents and letters from the first Christians, people who knew the apostles or lived within a generation of Jesus. These include the Didache, early 2nd century, a teaching manual attributed to the apostles, the epistles of Clement, late 1st century, written by a prominent Christian leader who also knew Peter. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch, early 2nd century. Ignatius was a student of the Apostle John. The Epistle of Barnabas, late 1st to early 2nd century, a widely read document in early Christian communities. The Shepherd of Hermas, early 2nd century, a popular Christian work that circulated among early believers. None of these writings at all, many of which were composed within a few decades of Jesus' death, mention anything about a future prophet named Ahmed or any prophecy about resembling what Muhammad claimed. These were some of the...
So this sort of argument is incredibly annoying. It's the same point. So what you want to do is you say, the claim is that it's implausible. Let me rephrase this. The claim is that if an early prophecy was made about Muhammad by Jesus, I can't remember if it's Jesus or Mary or something, but it doesn't matter. Let's just say by Jesus. The claim is that if that was made, then we would have a record of it in these extant texts, either what survives of the New Testament or these other extra biblical texts, right? So that's the claim. How can we assess the plausibility of that claim? Well, the first claim that Cameron was made is that, well, certainly something so important like that would be recorded in the Bible. Well, it seems plausibly not, right? Because we see at least one example where in the book of Mark, the resurrection of Jesus isn't either wasn't mentioned or was left off from the earliest texts that we have of it. So that seems to count against that claim. But, you know, that's only one example. Maybe there's other examples that we could look at that would be relevant to this claim. The point is, what we'd have to do is assess, look, what are the bodies of things that we would expect these different texts to say, and then how often do they say them, right? I actually have no idea if you'd expect, you know, Clement and whoever else, all of these early texts, to say anything about this prophecy. I don't know what they say in general, or what proportion of the prophecies that Jesus did make are included in these texts. That would be maybe a good baseline, right? Let's say Jesus made like 10 prophecies in his ministry. How many of them are included in these other texts? Because if the answer is like 1 or 2, then, well, it's not that implausible that there are some prophecies that weren't mentioned, right? Because we know that there were prophecies that weren't mentioned. Okay, that's, I mean, am I talking to, like, you know, 7-year-olds? That's how you do this analysis, right? If you're going to say these texts would have mentioned this prophecy, you can check that by saying, okay, here are the prophecies that we agree on that were made. Let's check how many of them are mentioned in these texts. If many of them aren't mentioned, then that undercuts your claim that prophecies will always be mentioned by these texts. Now, I don't know the answer to this, right? Because I haven't checked all these texts, but I'm going to guess, and in fact, I'd be willing to put money on the line, that there are many prophecies that are attributed to Jesus somewhere in the Gospels, which are not included in these different texts, right? That they don't always include all of the prophecies that Jesus made. And if that's true, then it's not that implausible that there were some prophecies that just never were mentioned in these other texts. And therefore, the fact that these other texts don't mention them is not really evidence for anything. Now, maybe there's more to unpick there and look at, you know, the specifics behind it, which I'm not familiar with. But the point I'm making here is, if you want to say that the absence of, I mean, fundamentally, you're saying that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, which is always kind of a problematic line. But sometimes it can be, right? It depends on the context. Fundamentally, what Cameron here is saying is that the fact that this prophecy is not mentioned in any extant copies of these texts, including biblical and extra biblical, is evidence against the prophecy existing. He needs to establish why we should believe that. And it's hard to know how you would do this, but one way you could do it is by looking at what these texts do mention versus compared to what we would expect that they would mention. So an example that was mentioned before is, I would expect more of these texts to mention people walking up, people rising from the graves and walking around Jerusalem. In fact, I'd expect other people to record this as well, like maybe Josephus, or even other authors that we don't have. Sorry, I just got triggered remembering something else that apologists sometimes say, which is like, well, which ancient source would you like to have recorded about this? And it's often hard to mention them because there aren't many of them. Look, the claim is here that many people wrote at the time whose records were not preserved because no one thought they were important enough to preserve, including many of the early Christian scholars who themselves were in charge of deciding like what was copied in the monasteries, right? The claim that I'm making and other counter apologists have made is that if many people did come up out of the graves and walk around in Jerusalem, people would have written about that, and people would have copied that claim, and it would have been preserved elsewhere, at least with high probability. Hard to say exactly who would have, maybe authors we don't even know about, or whose texts were never preserved. The vast majority of what was written in antiquity was not preserved, right? So it's very reasonable to say that authors we don't know about could have written, and that's much more likely to have been preserved if it recorded something this fantastic that supported an early Christian doctrine, right? I think it's very reasonable to say that someone would have written about this and it would have been preserved. But we don't have any of that. That's not definitive evidence that it didn't happen, but I think it's suggestive evidence that it didn't happen. So once again, if we're going to appeal to this argument that, well, if that happened, we would have records of it, we need to have a standard for assessing that. Okay, what would we expect to be included? And then what proportion of these claims are actually included in our sources, so we can sort of establish a baseline. That's what I was saying before about looking at the other prophecies of Jesus and seeing how many of them are included in like Clement and whatever else. So that would be establishing a baseline. Then the second part of that would be, let's look at other claims that we might expect to be mentioned and see if they are mentioned as well. The people rising up out of the graves would be an example of this that's not mentioned anywhere else. Another example would be the census that's recorded as being the reason why Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem. We don't have any records of that either, or of that practice for that matter, of sending people back to their hometown, which is completely absurd if you think about it. It makes no sense logistically because most people couldn't afford to travel. And why would you require them to do that anyway? You tax them where they are, not where they were born. Like, why the hell would you do that? There's no records of the Romans doing this because it's ridiculous, and they never did it, right? But anyway, I'm getting off track. The point is, if you're going to make this argument, you need to establish a baseline, and you need to then apply it consistently to other issues as well. You can't just pull out these criteria from nowhere, apply them when it suits you, and then discard them when it doesn't, which is exactly what Cameron is doing. And apologists do this all the time, and it really drives me insane.
The earliest Christian documents written at the time when the memories of Jesus' life and teachings were all very fresh on their minds. If Jesus had made such a world-changing prophecy, wouldn't somebody have written it down? Somebody. So let's go.
Well, hang on. You don't. Jeez. Cameron can't even get his own story straight, right? Muslims say it was written down. Well, actually, I don't know if they say that. I think that they say that. But the point is that they certainly could say that. What they say is that if it was written down, that was lost. Okay, they don't. It's they don't need to say that it wasn't written down. All they need to say is that if it was lost, and that's a very high probability claim that something that was written down was lost. Now, Cameron might say, yeah, but not this wouldn't be lost. Well, then we would have to establish, well, what else was not lost or not recorded by other people, and all of what I was saying before about baselines and whatever. And it completely fails to do that. But he can't even represent his own case correctly, because Muslims don't need to say that it wasn't written down, just that it was lost. Baseline, many things that were written down were lost, including about Jesus, right? So short ending Mark's classic example about this, right? So what's the problem? What is actually the problem? If you apply the same standard, it's just like Islam or Mormonism.
Oh, even deeper. We check early Jewish historical texts like the Talmud and writings from Josephus, a Jewish historian who documented events from the period. Again,
why would Josephus?
Nothing.
Josephus barely wrote anything about Jesus. Yeah, he wrote a few passages. Why would he record this random prophecy about a future? Like, he doesn't care. I think that's especially weak, because I know a little bit about that. Josephus did not write very much about Jesus. It's like a few paragraphs. In fact, I don't think he really wrote much of anything about Jesus himself. He wrote about the early Christian movement and some of what they said about Jesus. I don't see any reason why Josephus would have said anything about this prediction. I don't know why he would have cared. That seems a particularly weak reference. Anyway.
We also look into pagan records from the Roman Empire, which heavily
why
interacted
would they
with
have
Jews and other
cared?
Christians.
They wouldn't have recorded
no
that.
mention at all of a prophecy about Muhammad or Ahmed. So we ask.
The old pagan references about Jesus barely even say that he existed. They're like, oh yeah, there was a prophet called Jesus who like did some miracles, and then the Jews killed him. Like, that's what they say. If you look at the ancient pagan references to like non-Christian, non-Jewish writings that reference Jesus, they say almost nothing. Why would they mention this particular prophecy? There's no reason they would mention that. It's utterly ridiculous. It's just name dropping at this point. There's no reason you'd expect that these sources would mention this prophecy. Again, I'm not saying the prophecy existed. I'm just saying that Cameron's standards are not consistently applied, because it doesn't apply this to anything else that you might, or maybe they would have mentioned something about all these people coming up out of the graves. Like, that actually seems kind of more interesting than, oh, there's going to be some random other prophet in centuries in the future. Why would they care about that? People who were dead walking around Jerusalem, well, that's much more interesting to the Roman authorities, right? If that actually happened, they'd be like, there's maybe some issue going on there. Like, we've got to figure out what the Jews are up to. But oh, there's a prophet who's going to come in a few hundred years. They wouldn't care about that. So again, just applying this in its own to Cameron's own, applying Cameron's own criteria to various things that Christians already believe doesn't even work. Even obvious cases. Yeah, the testimony of Flaviarum is probably the Christian interpolation. It's thought that there are fragments of it that were authentic, but if you remove the interpolated parts, there's not much left. It's basically, yeah, there was a guy called Jesus, and he taught some stuff, and then he was killed. Like, it doesn't say much of anything. Likewise, the other apologists sometimes like to name drop all of the references to Jesus, but most of the references themselves are basically just name drops. They're like, oh yeah, there's this Jesus guy who a lot of people believe. It doesn't tell you really anything except that people believed in Jesus being a prophet or being the Son of God or whatever, and maybe that he was crucified, right? So that's a reason for thinking that Jesus probably existed, right? Which is one reason I'm not a mythicist, because we do have these other sources. Plus the prior is low, the prior in favor of someone like that existing is high, so I don't see the reason to disbelieve it. There's a bunch of reasons, but the point is, evidence needs to match the claim. If the claim is that Jesus existed, was known as a miracle worker, was an apocalyptic prophet, taught a bunch of stuff, and then was killed by the Roman authorities for being a nuisance. That's all very plausible, right? And that matches the evidence, including the sorts of references that Cameron's talking about. But then he starts saying, well, yeah, but these sources should also be saying all these other things, which they don't say. Well, it's sort of unclear why we would expect that. Why would they mention a prophecy of another prophet coming? Well, who would care about this? The only people who would care about it are the early Christian community. And they don't even seem to mention other things that we would expect them to mention, like the people coming up out of the graves, for example, or the resurrection in the short ending of Mark, or a bunch of other things that are only mentioned in one gospel. So again, the standard doesn't apply. So what are we doing? We're just making things up at this point. We're just saying what's convenient at the time.
Ask if this prophecy was real. Why do none of our earliest sources, written within even 10 to 40 years after Jesus' death, mention it?
Come on, what the hell was written within 10 years of Jesus' death? There was nothing written within 10 years. Come on. That's a very early dating.
Is closest to the events, and instead the prophecy only appears in the Quran, written over 600 years after Jesus. This time...
Yeah, because the prophecy was lost, right? And God revealed it through Muhammad again. I'm not saying I believe that, right? or that there's any evidence for that. What I'm saying is that the fact that there's no independent evidence for this claim is not evidence against Islam any more than the lack of independent evidence for all of the things we were talking about with respect to Christianity is evidence against Christianity. They're on exactly the same standing.
Gap should make us, to put it gently, skeptical. Generally speaking, earlier sources are more reliable than later ones, especially when it comes to historical events, just like in the case...
But that doesn't work here, right? Because, oh, geez. It's like he's heard that so many times from other apologists that he repeats that even when it's not relevant, okay? So Muslims are not going to tell you. In fact, Muslims, in the Islamic tradition, they're way better at preserving authorship than the Christians. The Christians don't care about this. Like, we don't know who the hell wrote most of the New Testament because they didn't bother to keep sufficient records about this. Now, early Muslim communities were much more concerned about establishing the tradition. So they have this process, I don't remember the Arabic name for it, where in order, like, this is how the hadith are, the sayings about Muhammad, this is how they're authenticated, right? Or this is supposed to be the process, that each of them begins with effectively the chain of transmission of its testimony. So it'll say something like, so-and-so said to so-and-so, said, or it goes the other way. So-and-so heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so, who heard it from the prophet, right? Or who saw it with the prophet. Isnad, yeah, thanks. So there's this sort of chain of transmission, which is recorded orally first, and then it's written down. Now, there are some of that are considered more plausible than others, and there's this various process for authenticating them. That's obviously beyond what I know much about, but I know that it exists, and it seems to me that that's the sort of thing you would want, right? As sort of a chain of providence for what you're talking about, and for where certain traditions or sayings come from. Christianity doesn't have anything like that, so I already think that Islam is kind of ahead of Christianity in that respect. So the point is, Muslims are very aware of this issue when it comes to the earliness of the source. Now, no sensible Muslim is going to say that the reason you should accept this prophecy is because of the textual providence of when it's recorded, right? That's not the point. The point is not that it was transmitted through documents, and that Muhammad found out about it, right? Because that's not how it was transmitted at all. The reason that they would say you should accept it is because Muhammad said it, and he got it from God, right? And in turn, you should believe in Muhammad because of these other reasons, right? They'll point to the Quran. They'll say, look, Quran is proof of Muhammad's prophethood. That's why you should accept him, and then you should accept what he said about this prophecy, which he got from God, right? Just like he got the Quran from God. So it's the same thing with Joseph Smith. It's a consequence of their belief system. It's not an evidence for it. So this prophecy is not evidence for the prophet that a non-Muslim would accept, obviously. They would point, yeah, the Quran, that's the evidence for the prophet. Read the Quran. That's what they'll say. They're not going to say that this claim in the Quran was like sourced from documents or something like that, and therefore it should be accepted over earlier documentary traditions. That's not the point at all. The point is, if it was recorded, it was lost. Muhammad received the revelation, and so he was able to sort of return it to us. Just like that's exactly what Joseph Smith is saying. So there is a parallel there. But the point is, it doesn't matter when that happens, whether it's 6 years, 600 years, or 6,000 years after Jesus. That's totally irrelevant because it's not about a textual transmission. It's about, do you accept Muhammad as a genuine prophet of God, right? Because if so, then he can receive revelations about things that were previously lost. There's no issue there, right? The issue is, do you accept Muhammad as a prophet? Do you accept Joseph Smith as a prophet? Do you accept Jesus as the Son of God, right? It's the same in all of the cases. Again, Cameron refuses to see the parallel there and refuses to apply consistent standards. And instead, it's like he just hears these talking points like, oh, earlier sources are better, and lots of sources are better than fewer. And he's applying them here where they're just not relevant. The point is not that we're looking at a textual source that's 600 years afterwards. Well, yes, literally that's true, but it's not a textual tradition dating back to earlier manuscripts. It's not preserving that at all. It's a completely different process or alleged process. And it comes down to whether you think the evidence for Muhammad being a prophet is good or bad. But you can't use it as evidence for that, obviously. Muslims would understand this. They would say, no, you don't believe in Muhammad because of this prophecy. You believe in Muhammad because of the Quran. And then, yeah, as an extra sort of bonus after the fact, you see, oh, yeah, cool, there was a prophecy that came from Jesus, and we're linking it back to Jesus. Yeah, they believe that, right? But that's not the evidence for it. That's a corollary of their position. It's not evidence for their position. Yeah, same as Paul said it, so you should believe it. How do we know that Paul had a vision of Jesus? Well, he said so. Like, we don't actually have any other witnesses to that. Paul said so. Interesting question as to how he knew it was Jesus, by the way, because Paul never met Jesus, but I guess that's a further point. Well, Jesus said it was Jesus. Well, yeah, but if Satan appeared to Paul and said, hey, I'm Jesus, like, couldn't Satan do that? Anyway, I'm getting off the point here, but yeah, I could probably use Paul as a better example of a lot of these cases, because a lot of what we know about Christian teachings just comes through Paul, and it's very interesting to ask where he got this information from. But anyway, the point is, yes, Cameron does not apply consistent standards. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. We should probably get to the end anyway, because I've been going off too long.
Prophecy to them and them only. This is a massive red flag. The only source for this prophecy is in the Quran itself, a book literally written by Muhammad. We're left.
Ooh. See, I mean, that's fine from a Christian point of view or a secular point of view, right? That Muhammad wrote the Quran. Although I'm not even sure I'd quite say that, right? Because it was compiled after he died. So I don't think it's quite right to say he wrote it. It probably contains a lot of his sayings, which were then compiled and put together after he died. But certainly from a Muslim point of view, if you're trying to represent the Muslim position, they're not going to say Muslims don't believe that Muhammad wrote the Quran, just like Mormons don't believe that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. There is a slight difference there because Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, according to Mormons. Whereas, as I understand it, Muslims say that Muhammad just recited the Quran. Like, basically, God told it to him word for word, and in Arabic, essentially. And he just recited it, which is not quite what Mormons say about Joseph Smith, although there's some disputes there. But anyway, there's subtle differences that don't really matter for the point of view here. If Cameron is trying to critique what Muslims say by doing an internal critique, which is what he said at the start, in looking at the internal logic, you can't just say something like Muhammad wrote the Quran. Well, no, he didn't, right? He's supposed to be reciting it from God. And so God's telling him this stuff. So what's the problem if God tells him about a prophecy that was previously lost? What you would have to establish is that we should have evidence of this prophecy. And Cameron just completely failed to establish that. He just sort of said it and then referenced a whole bunch of texts and made no effort to establish whether we would expect those texts to mention this prophecy or not, and didn't engage with other examples where it seems that there are things that very plausibly should be mentioned, like people coming back from the dead, or like the resurrection of Jesus himself, which isn't mentioned in the earliest version of Mark, or like the Roman census practice, like these other things, right? Plausibly, you'd expect those to be mentioned by early Christian texts, but they're not, or non-Christian texts. And so we need to do the comparison. We need to analyze how plausible it is that different things will be mentioned, but he doesn't do any of that. So he's not doing all the things he should be. He's not presenting a fair case of what the different traditions actually believe, and then he's not doing a fair comparison by assessing them using a consistent set of standards. Yes, sorry, an angel, but yeah, so yeah, God revealed the Quran to Muhammad via an angel. Yeah, that's right.
In the exact same situation as Joseph Smith. There is no outside verification. This leads us to our last.
Same with Paul. Same with Paul. Same with the virgin birth. Same with Jesus being divine. Like, what's the evidence that he was divine? We only have his word for it, right? And then you can say, well, the resurrection proves it. But then that's the same as what a Mormon's going to say. This guy, oh, the Book of Mormon proves it. They'll point to something else, right? The Book of Mormon proves it. The Quran proves it. The resurrection proves it. Yeah, but for the claim itself, we only actually have your word for it, my man. There's no independent verification there. So it's exactly the same.
Question. Question 4. Who told you about this prophecy? Muhammad's answer? Me. And again, just like with Joseph Smith.
So how do we know Jesus is God or the Son of God? Me, as in Jesus, right? What's the difference? How do we know that? How do we know that God or that Jesus appeared to Paul? Right? Paul, he tells us that. We don't have any other evidence. It's exactly the same.
This makes the prophecy impossible to verify. It's his word against, well, nobody else's. There's no independent confirmation, no other records, just Muhammad's claim that God told him Jesus said it. So here's the parallel between the two cases. Both Joseph Smith and Muhammad claimed that a previous prophet predicted their coming, and both said that all records of this prophecy had been lost. Then both claimed that God conveniently re-revealed this lost prophecy to them and them only. This is a massive red flag for any prophet because it puts their entire claim in a hopelessly circular loop. Guys,
okay, this is where he's wrong, right? Because yes, it's true that it's true about the idea that that Mormons and Muslims both claim that there were prophecies made about Joseph Smith and Muhammad, which were subsequently lost and re-revealed by their prophet. Yes, that's all true. But what's the problem? Well, the problem is supposed to be that means that the evidence for them is circular. But in both cases, Mormons and Muslims don't appeal to those prophecies as any significant key core evidence for prophethood. They appeal to other things. They appeal to the Book of Mormon primarily and the Quran. That's what they appeal to. It's not the prophecy. That's kind of a corollary or icing on the cake or whatever. It's subsidiary. And so Cameron's just misrepresenting these positions here. And likewise, it's just exactly the same as the situation in the case of whether it doesn't involve an old prophecy being lost. It generally involves old prophecies being reinterpreted, which I regard as fundamentally equivalent, right? When it comes to Jesus being the Son of God, we just have his word for it, right? How can you independently verify that? Likewise, Jesus appearing to Paul, what independent evidence do we have from that? We just have Paul's word for it. And it's also unclear how even he would know that. But anyway, I guess you could say that about Joseph Smith and Muhammad as well. How did they know that they were receiving the revelation from God, not someone else? That's a fair question. But the point is, I just don't know how you can not see this parallel. Jesus didn't write shit. Yeah, well, even if he did, right, and he wrote down, hey, I'm the Son of God, like, well, how would we know? How would we know if he's the Son of God? How do you verify a claim like that? Christians would typically say, well, you look at the resurrection, you look at Jesus's other claims and his healings, life and ministry, blah, blah, blah. But then that's exactly what Mormons say about Joseph Smith. That's exactly what Muslims say about Muhammad. Like it's the same thing, right? So what's the difference? Why is it that this is a knockdown argument against those two, but not in the case of Christianity? The only difference that I can see is that Christians don't say that there were lost prophecies about Jesus from the Old Testament. But they say almost exactly the same thing, which is that those prophecies were not understood at the time or subsequently, and that their true meaning was only first understood by Christians. And I just don't see any difference to that. That is the same thing. It's just, instead of the text being lost, it's the meaning of the text being lost. It amounts to the same thing. It's just as self-serving and it's just as non-evidential.
I'm a prophet because I say I'm a prophet. Are you starting to see the pattern here? In both cases, the prophets set themselves up as the sole source of information that could confirm their prophethood. That's something that
Oh yeah, but all prophets do that, like including Jesus and Paul, right? They set themselves up as being the authorities for what the scriptures say and how to interpret them. Every prophet does that. No prophet actually appeals to anything that's independently verifiable and not within their control. This is what I was saying before. There's always the twofold problem of how do you establish that the prophecy was originally made and wasn't changed? And then secondly, how do you establish that the prophecy was fulfilled without anyone deliberately ensuring that it was fulfilled or reinterpreted? So there's the before and after way of looking at it. And every claim of a Brittany prophet that I've ever looked at, or really any religious miracle claim or anything like that, always falls foul to one of these, that you can't establish both of them. You can't establish that a prophecy was made and recorded and that was accurately and precisely preserved, whilst at the same time not affecting the events that it allegedly prophesied about. And those are the two things you need to establish, right? That it was fulfilled, and it was fulfilled not in a way that involved people deliberately trying to ensure that it was fulfilled or reinterpreting it in a way that ensured it was fulfilled. You don't have that for any religious tradition, in my opinion, and you certainly don't have that in the case of Jesus, because all of the prophecies that were allegedly about him, we can't independently verify that. We can't independently verify that they were fulfilled, like that he was born in Bethlehem or virgin birth, or the only way that we can the only way that you get a prophecy at all is to reinterpret what was a text that was never interpreted in that way in the first place. So it's precisely the same problem, that the prophet establishes themselves as the sole source of authority for establishing their prophethood, either by directly revealing text or words or sayings or new teachings, which is what Jesus and Paul both did, or by reinterpreting old texts or old evidence, old writings, which again is what Jesus and Paul and Muhammad and Joseph Smith and every prophet ever has ever done, right? They all do the same thing, and it's all equally problematic because you can't independently verify it, which brings us right back to the beginning of the discussion, which is how do you verify special revelation? The answer is, in theory, you could do this using the right sort of prophecies, the right sort of checks. In practice, extremely difficult, and we at least God hasn't figured out how to put it into practice appropriately. Like, you'd think that God could figure this out, right? By getting Jesus to reveal things, or Muhammad to reveal things that truly could not have been known at the time by any natural means, but then can subsequently be verified, like the thousandth digit of pi. Maybe you can think of better examples than that. That's just one that comes to mind. But God just hadn't thought of that, and so what we find are just much less well established or much less clear examples that can always be reinterpreted in different ways. I mean, my conclusion there is that there is no genuine special revelation, but the problem is a genuine one, which is how you could even establish special revelation if it existed. And Cameron's highlighting that problem, but the issue is that he's firstly misrepresenting the positions that he's critiquing, Islam and Mormonism, and the second problem is that he's not appropriately applying the same critical standards to his own faith tradition.
Actual prophet of God would ever do. And moreover, God is not a bumbling idiot. Like, he wouldn't try to establish
well he is though, right? Like, if you read about if you listen to Christians, or really any faith tradition for that matter, who believe in God, and ask them what God wants or what his purpose is, and then you look at what's actually happened over history, like, clearly God's a bumbling idiot. Now, I just think that's overwhelmingly the best interpretation. Like, God wants everyone to know about the salvific mission of Jesus, right? So he reveals it to this tiny group of people, most of whom are illiterate, in the ancient Near East. And throughout most of history, only a tiny fraction of the human population has ever been able to be aware of that information. Why would you do that, God? Like, interesting move, like, interesting strategy. If you're going to appeal to this logic about God not being a bumbling idiot, you have to apply it consistently. And either you say, and it seems that either Cameron doesn't apply this standard and he says, well, we can't know mysterious ways, whatever, or he comes up with a better explanation for all of these other implausible things that God has done, which, well, always open to hearing them, but I've never found anything very plausible, and most of them just amount to he had his reasons without saying what those reasons are. So again, inconsistent standards. You can't say God wouldn't do this because it doesn't make sense, it's inefficient, it seems illogical, and ignore all the other inefficient, nonsensical things that God's allegedly done in the Christian view.
A true prophet in this way. Now, at this point, Muslim apologists might claim that Muhammad's miracles, like the splitting of the moon, prove his prophethood. But here's the problem. Other than
Yeah, some say that, but mostly that isn't what they say. Mostly they say that the Quran is the preeminent miracle of Muhammad, and that is what establishes his prophethood. Yeah, they sometimes point out to the splitting of the moon and some other things, but that's, from what I've always read, subsidiary. It's always the Quran first and foremost. Just like for Mormons, it's the Book of Mormon. Yeah, they may appeal to some other things, but it's the Book of Mormon. It's preeminent. I don't understand how this is hard to see from Cameron's point of view. Like, this is just you can just read this, right? This is what they say.
the Quran's say so, none of our non-Muslim sources actually report this incredible event of the moon splitting in half or any of the other Islamic miracles. And then later Islamic,
just like all those people who came up, out of the dead from the grave in Matthew, like, just like no one else records this. Are we going to apply consistent standards, or just apply whatever's convenient at the time? It gets a bit old because it's like just the same thing over and over again.
sources reporting these miracle accounts only emerge 100 to 250 years after his death as very obvious legends. But more importantly, even if Muhammad did perform miracles, it still wouldn't matter. As Jesus warned in Matthew 24:24, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Miracles alone are not enough to establish a true prophet. God would not validate.
Didn't Cameron start this video by saying that miracles were one way that you could tell? Maybe, I don't know that he said that they were sufficient, so there's no strict contradiction, I suppose, but he did say that they were important or helpful or something like that. Whereas it seems from that passage, they're not really helpful at all. I guess technically you would want to ask, well, okay, so what rate do we see miracles from genuine prophets versus false prophets? Or conditional on there being a miracle, what is the probability that they're a false prophet compared to if you haven't conditioned on that miracle, like just unconditionally? Technically, that's what you'd want to look at. And I have no idea how you'd establish that baseline, which really just gets us back to the question of how do you establish whether someone is a genuine prophet? Well, signs and miracles aren't going to do it. So where are we? And what it comes down to, of course, as I've been saying throughout this video, is that it just comes down to their say-so. They say that they're revealing a message from God, and they'll make other claims and appeals, but ultimately everything comes down to the fact that they've said so. And so do you trust them based on your beliefs about God and what he would be likely to do or not? Like, that's what it comes down to. Do you believe them?
Someone with such a sketchy backstory, like where the prophecy about this person is conveniently lost and then only re-revealed to the prophet himself. I mean, just think about it. Like this whole scenario where a prophet claims to be foretold but can't produce any evidence besides his own word is not the kind of thing that a true prophet would do. And it's certainly not something.
I mean, think about this. Think about where a prophet claims to have been born of a virgin, but can't produce any evidence for that, apart from the fact that their mother said so. It's pretty suspicious, don't you think? Or how about someone claims that okay, so get this right. There's a religious teacher who is killed, and then someone who never met them claims that they were just walking along one day, and this religious teacher appeared to them and told them, become a prophet for me, and then goes and basically tells everyone in the church what to do. That's kind of suspicious, don't you think? Like, how can anyone verify that Jesus really did appear? Oops, I spelt the beans here. Yeah, I'm talking about Jesus principle. How can anyone verify that? Again, inconsistent standards. You can say all of these same things about Jesus or Paul or other instances with respect to early Christianity. It's just that Cameron refuses to think about that or refuses to apply that same analysis into those cases. Moon splitting is way more believable than sun standing still for a day. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that. I'm not sure which I'd be more ready to believe, to be honest. Thank you, Kevigan of Alexandria. That's a cool name, by the way.
Something that God, who is maximally wise and omnipotent and omniscient, would ever oversee or endorse. The idea that God would design a prophecy, let it be completely forgotten, and then re-reveal it to the only person it's about is beyond absurd. Like, I can't get over it. That's why no matter how many miracles or wonders Muhammad is said to have performed, his claim collapses just like Joseph Smith's. Without question, Muhammad is a fake prophet. Oh, and by the way, you'll never catch Jesus Christ doing any of this shady fake prophet stuff because Christianity is actually true.
Jeez. I thought we were going to get some substantive point there. But Jesus does it. Like the case of the virgin birth is just clear. I don't know if Jesus himself actually says this, but to my point of view, it doesn't really matter whether he says it or one of his followers says it. There's no other way to verify any of that information. And likewise, all of the prophecies allegedly from the Old Testament about him, no one interpreted them in these ways until Jesus. Like, I mean, I've already mentioned them, like the idea that the Messiah is crucified for our and like dies for our sins, and then is resurrected. That was not something that was ever believed until Christians started teaching it. So it's the same thing. It doesn't matter whether the words are alleged to have been lost or whether the meaning is alleged to have been lost. It comes down to the same thing. And likewise, all of the other claims that Jesus made about himself, which none of which can be independently verified. I think that Cameron is stuck on this just because these faith traditions, Mormonism and Islam, are not something he's familiar with. Right? They're not his faith traditions. So he looks at them from an outsider's point of view and sees these issues. But he can't or won't apply that same standard to his own faith tradition because he's familiar with it. And as soon as he starts even trying to apply this outsider's standard, all of the typical apologetic excuses and just so stories immediately come in, and you sort of can't even complete the process, right? It's like the defense mechanisms come up before you can even get going, before you can even finish the process of critique. And so the critique never actually gets completed, and you never actually see that, in fact, there is this parallel there. Now, I think I've made that point a million times, so I don't need to say that again. Claim here that the virgin birth in Luke is an obvious insert. I don't actually care if it's an insert or not. Like, either way, it's sort of problematic, right? If it's an insert, then it shows that these texts can be changed later, which undermines the claim that they would be preserved, which Cameron's claim relies on, the fact that these important things would be preserved and not lost or inserted. And if it's original, well, then it raises the question as to where the claim even comes from, because how can you independently verify it? Like I mean, that's a problem either way. Like, it doesn't matter whether it's inserted or not. It's a problem for Cameron, right? And that's the case with most of these issues. That the particularities of exactly who wrote it often doesn't matter, because the logic of it is still similar. How can you verify this information, and why is it that the interpretation given to Old Testament passages is completely changed by the Christians? That's not what you'd expect, or at least maybe it is what you'd expect if you have weird expectations. But if that's the case, then it doesn't actually serve as evidence. It's just a corollary of your belief system that understandings of doctrines change with new prophets and new teachings can be revealed. Why is it that we only get entirely new doctrines about the Trinity and about the resurrection and the atonement and all of this other stuff from Jesus, when none of these things are mentioned in the Old Testament? Oh, except they are mentioned, but the only people who see them there are Christians, and they were never seen by anyone beforehand. They only became obvious to Christians who read them post hoc through their beliefs about Jesus, right? That's just as suspicious as the idea that Joseph Smith receives a prophecy about receives revelation about a prophecy that was lost, allegedly lost, right? Or Muhammad. It's the same in all cases, right? It's all self-serving, and it's all impossible to independently verify, and that's the problem with special revelation. So this video was sort of useful in elucidating that problem, although I don't think Cameron did a very good job at explaining it, because he misrepresented the views of Mormons and Muslims. They don't think that it's these prophecies that are particularly important evidence of prophethood. They're just corollaries of the fact that these people were prophets, that they also received revelation that that their prophethood had been predicted or prophesied beforehand. Which, yeah, obviously is self-serving, right? But again, is it more self-serving than anything Jesus said about himself? I don't really understand. And so I think that if you apply the same standard, you see that these problems that Cameron raises are just as problematic for Christianity as they are for the religious traditions that he critiques. And it's disappointing that the only sort of acknowledgement we get of this potential for his criticisms to be applied to Christianity is literally like 4 seconds at the end, where he just says, yeah, but Christianity is true. Which is a defense, of course, that Mormons and Muslims could give. They could, in some sense, just agree with everything that Cameron has said, that, like, well, most of what Cameron has said about, yeah, look, maybe it even is suspicious, right? But they could just say, yeah, but Joseph Smith was a prophet, like, or Muhammad was a prophet, so it doesn't matter. In which case, like, why even bother if you're just going to be satisfied with responses like that? It doesn't matter how suspicious in our lights it is whether Joseph Smith or Muhammad made this or that prophecy about, stated this or that prophecy that had been revealed to them. If you have sufficient independent reasons for believing that they were prophets, it'd be just like, okay, well, I guess that's what God wanted to reveal, regardless of what I think about it. And that's what Cameron would say if you critique all of these other things that I've been mentioning about early Christianity. People just don't care. They just say, well, yeah, but that's what happened. That's the way God wanted to do it. Because if you believe in the prophet in question, then you just accept all of these things. Many people do, at least. They accept them, right? And it's because they already accept the prophet, they just trust what they say, because there's never independent corroborating evidence in any case. All right, I think that's enough for now. As usual, I went for longer than I'd intended. That video was really underwhelming. I'm just having a quick look at the comments here. My favorite irony is how Joseph Smith and Muhammad both claimed that God told them you're allowed to sleep with anyone they want, and everyone else's wives are their property. Not quite what quite what God told Joseph Smith, although it's true that he sort of acted in that way. Yeah, well, once again, yeah, I guess we needn't get into that. That's a whole other video. Some atheists claim that we only believe in Jesus Christ because miracles, as you say, miracles alone is not enough. We need a package deal, and the Bible provides it. So it's just the Bible says so, right? It's the same thing as what Mormons and Muslims would say. Oh, yeah. All right, well, thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found that interesting. I'll have to do I did want to compare this to the prophecy about the Trump thing, but I'll have to do that in another video because I need to get to bed. But yeah, that'll provide some good content for another time. Thanks everyone for listening. I've got a question about my book here. Whoops. Can I read chunks of your book Unreasonable Faith a la carte? I'm not entirely sure what that means. If you mean, can you read it out of order? I actually talk about this in the introduction, which I suppose if you were intending to read the book out of order, you probably wouldn't read the introduction. So I don't know that there's any way around that, though. The chapters can be read independently and don't really depend on each other. And the sections within chapters can largely be read independently as well. So that should be fine. I sort of wrote it that way, that it's kind of modular. But of course, regardless of whether I wrote it that way, you can kind of just read it however you want, right? And if something doesn't make sense, you can always jump backwards. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question. If you want to ask more, feel free to email me about the book. All right, thanks everyone for listening. Hope this exercise was informative. I hope that it's useful to like unpack these things and explain where Cameron's gone wrong and the false in his reasoning, because I mean, I know that the people who comment on his videos are obviously a self-selected group, but it does seem like that there's a subset of people who just lap this up and don't think about it critically at all, which is disappointing. I do know Cameron curates his comments as well, so maybe there's some aspect of that. But anyway, so yeah, I think it is important to show the problems here, and particularly to show to religious people, like apologists and those who follow them, how inconsistent they are at applying a fair standard to their own faith and other faiths. And that's one of the most basic intellectual virtues I think one needs to have, is fairness in applying the same standard. And I think that that's one that apologists violate all the time. So this was, I think, a good example of this. Cheers, everyone. I need to get to bed soon because I have a conference to go to tomorrow. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully I'll catch you again soon. Bye.